Chapter 12 of Northanger Abbey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, Chapter 12.
"Mrs. Allen,"
said Catherine the next morning,
"will there be any harm in my calling in Miss Tilney to-day? I shall not be easy till I have explained everything."
"Go by all means, my dear, only put on a white gown. Miss Tilney always wears white."
Catherine cheerfully complied, and, being properly equipped, was more impatient than ever to be at the pump-room, that she might inform herself of General Tilney's lodgings, for though she believed they were in Milsom Street, she was not certain of the house, and Mrs. Allen's wavering convictions only made it more doubtful. To Milsom Street she was directed, and having made herself perfect in the number, hastened away with eager steps and a beating heart to pay her visit, explain her conduct, and be forgiven. Tripping lightly through the churchyard, and resolutely turning away her eyes, that she might not be obliged to see her beloved Isabella and her dear family, who she had reason to believe were in a shop hard by, she reached the house without any impediment, looked at the number, knocked at the door, and inquired for Miss Tilney. The man
believed Miss Tilney to be at home, but was not quite certain. Would she be pleased to say off her name?
She gave her card. In a few minutes the servant returned, and with a look which did not quite confirm his words, said,
He had been mistaken, for that Miss Tilney was walked out.
Catherine, with a blush of mortification, left the house. She felt almost persuaded that Miss Tilney was at home, and too much offended to admit her, and as she retired down the street could not withhold one glance at the drawing-room windows, in expectation of seeing her there, but no one appeared at them. At the bottom of the street, however, she looked back again, and then, not at a window, but issuing from the door, she saw Miss Tilney herself. She was followed by a gentleman whom Catherine believed to be her father, and they turned up towards Edgar's buildings. Catherine, in deep mortification, proceeded on her way. She could almost be angry herself at such angry incivility, but she checked the resentful sensation. She remembered her own ignorance. She knew not how such an offence as hers might be classed by the laws of worldly politeness, to what a degree of unforgivingness it might with propriety lead, nor to what rigours of rudeness in return it might justly make her amenable. Dejected and humbled, she had even some thoughts of not going with the others to the theatre that night, but it must be confessed that they were not of long continuance, for she soon recollected, in the first place, that she was without any excuse for staying at home, and, in the second, that it was a play she wanted very much to see. To the theatre, accordingly, they all went. No Tilneys appeared to plague or please her. She feared that amongst the many perfections of the family, a fondness for plays was not to be ranked, but perhaps it was because they were habituated to the finer performances of the London stage, which she knew, on Isabella's authority, rendered everything else of the kind
quite horrid.
She was not deceived in her own expectation of pleasure. The comedy so well suspended her care that no one, observing her during the first 4 acts, would have supposed she had any wretchedness about her. On the beginning of the 5th, however, the sudden view of Mr. Henry Tilney and his father joining a party in the opposite box recalled her to anxiety and distress. The stage could no longer excite genuine merriment, no longer keep her whole attention. Every other look, upon an average, was directed towards the opposite box, and for the space of 2 entire scenes did she thus watch Henry Tilney, without being once able to catch his eye. No longer could he be suspected of indifference for a play. His notice was never withdrawn from the stage during 2 whole scenes. At length, however, he did look towards her, and he bowed. But such a bow! No smile, no continued observance attended it. His eyes were immediately returned to their former direction. Catherine was restlessly miserable. She could almost have run round to the box in which he sat and forced him to hear her explanation. Feelings rather natural than heroic possessed her. Instead of considering her own dignity injured by this ready condemnation, instead of proudly resolving in conscious innocence to show her resentment towards him who could harbour a doubt of it, to leave him to all the trouble of seeking an explanation, and to enlighten him on the past only by avoiding his sight or flirting with somebody else, she took to herself all the shame of misconduct, or at least of its appearance, and was only eager for an opportunity of explaining its cause. The play concluded, the curtain fell. Henry Tilney was no longer to be seen where he had hitherto sat, but his father remained, and perhaps he might be now coming round to their box. She was right. In a few minutes he appeared, and making his way through the then thinning rows, spoke with like calm politeness to Mrs. Allen and her friend. Not with such calmness was he answered by the latter.
"Oh, Mr. Tilney, I have been quite wild to speak to you, and make my apologies. You must have thought me so rude, but indeed it was not my own fault, was it, Mrs. Allen? Did not they tell me that Mr. Tilney and his sister were gone out in a phaeton together? And then what could I do? But I had 10,000 times rather have been with you. Now had not I, Mrs. Allen?"
"My dear, you tumble my gown,"
was Mrs. Allen's reply. Her assurance, however, standing sole as it did, was not thrown away. It brought a more cordial, more natural smile into his countenance, and he replied in a tone which retained only a little affected reserve.
"We were much obliged to you, at any rate, for wishing us a pleasant walk, after our passing you in Argyle Street. You were so kind as to look back on purpose."
"But indeed I did not wish you a pleasant walk. I never thought of such a thing, but I begged Mr. Thorpe so earnestly to stop. I called out to him as soon as ever I saw you. Now, Mrs. Allen, did not— Oh, you were not there. But indeed I did, and if Mr. Thorpe would only have stopped, I would have jumped out and run after you."
Is there a Henry in the world who could be insensible to such a declaration? Henry Tilney, at least, was not. With a yet sweeter smile he said everything that need be said of his sister's concern, regret, and dependence on Catherine's honour.
"Oh, do not say Miss Tilney was not angry,"
cried Catherine,
"because I know she was, for she would not see me this morning when I called. I saw her walk out of the house the next minute after my leaving it. I was hurt, but I was not affronted. Perhaps you did not know I had been there."
"I was not within at the time, but I heard of it from Eleanor, and she has been wishing ever since to see you, to explain the reason of such incivility, but perhaps I can do it as well. It was nothing more than that my father— they were just preparing to walk out, and he being hurried for time, and not caring to have it put off, made a point of her being denied. That was all, I do assure you. She was very much vexed, and meant to make her apology as soon as possible."
Catherine's mind was greatly eased by this information, yet a something of solicitude remained, from which sprang the following question, thoroughly artless in itself, though rather distressing to the gentleman.
"But, Mr. Tilney, why were you less generous than your sister? If she felt such confidence in my good intentions, and could suppose it to be only a mistake, why should you be so ready to take offence?"
"Me? I take offence?
"Nay, I am sure by your look, when you came into the box, you were angry."
I angry? I could have no right."
"Well, nobody would have thought you had no right who saw your face,"
he replied, by asking her to make room for him, and talking of the play. He remained with them some time, and was only too agreeable for Catherine to be contented when he went away. Before they parted, however, it was agreed that the projected walk should be taken as soon as possible, and setting aside the misery of his quitting their box, she was, upon the whole, left one of the happiest creatures in the world. While talking to each other, she had observed with some surprise that John Thorpe, who was never in the same part of the house for 10 minutes together, was engaged in conversation with General Tilney, and she felt something more than surprise when she thought she could perceive herself the object of their attention and discourse. What could they have to say of her? She feared General Tilney did not like her appearance. She found it was implied in his preventing her admittance to his daughter, rather than postpone his own walk a few minutes.
"How came Mr. Thorpe to know your father?"
was her anxious inquiry, as she pointed them out to her companion. He
"Knew nothing about it, but his father, like every military man, had a very large acquaintance."
When the entertainment was over, Thorpe came to assist them in getting out. Catherine was the immediate object of his gallantry, and while they waited in the lobby for a chair, he prevented the inquiry which had travelled from her heart almost to the tip of her tongue, by asking in a consequential manner whether she had seen him talking with General Tilney.
"He's a fine old fellow, upon my soul. Stout, active, looks as young as his son. I have a great regard for him, I assure you. A gentleman-like, good sort of fellow as ever lived."
"But how came you to know him?"
"Know him? There are few people much about town that I do not know. I have met him for ever at the Bedford, and I knew his face again to-day the moment he came into the billiard-room. One of the best players we have, by the by. And we had a little touch together, though I was almost afraid of him at first. The odds were 5-4 against me, and, If I had not made one of the cleanest strokes that perhaps ever was made in this world, I took his ball exactly. But I could not make you understand it without a table. However, I did beat him, a very fine fellow, as rich as a Jew. I should like to dine with him. I dare say he gives famous dinners. But what do you think we have been talking of? You! Yes, by heavens! And the General thinks you the finest girl in Bath.
Oh, nonsense! How can you say so?
And what do you think I said?
Lowering his voice.
Well done, General, said I. I am quite of your mind.
Here, Catherine, who was much less gratified by his admiration than by General Tilney's, was not sorry to be called away by Mr. Allen. Thorpe, however, would see her to her chair, and, till she entered it, continued the same kind of delicate flattery, in spite of her entreating him to have done. That General Tilney, instead of disliking, should admire her was very delightful, and she joyfully thought that there was not one of the family whom she need now fear to meet. The evening had done more, much more for her than could have been expected. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Northanger Abbey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. Chapter 13. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday have now passed in review before the reader. The events of each day, its hopes and fears, mortifications and pleasures, have been separately stated, and the pangs of Sunday only now remain to be described, and close the week. The Clifton scheme had been deferred, not relinquished, and on the afternoon's crescent of this day it was brought forward again. In a private consultation between Isabella and James, the former of whom had particularly set her heart upon going, and the latter no less anxiously placed his upon pleasing her, it was agreed that, provided the weather were fair, the party should take place on the following morning, and they were to set off very early, in order to be at home in good time. The affair thus determined, and Thorpe's approbation secured, Catherine only remained to be apprised of it. She had left them for a few minutes to speak to Miss Tilney. In that interval the plan was completed, and as soon as she came again her agreement was demanded. But instead of the gay acquiescence expected by Isabella, Catherine looked grave, was
very sorry,
but could not go.
The engagement, which ought to have kept her from joining in the former attempt, would make it impossible for her to accompany them now. She had that moment settled with Miss Tilney to take their proposed walk to-morrow. It was quite determined, and she would not, upon any account, retract.
But that she must and should retract was instantly the eager cry of both the Thorpes.
They must go to Clifton to-morrow. They would not go without her.
It would be nothing to put off a mere walk for one day longer, and they would not hear of a refusal.
Catherine was distressed, but not subdued.
Do not urge me, Isabella. I am engaged to Miss Tilney. I cannot go.
This availed nothing. The same arguments assailed her again. She must go, she should go, and they would not hear of a refusal.
It would be so easy to tell Miss Tilney that you had just been reminded of a prior engagement, and must only beg to put off the walk till Tuesday.
No, it would not be easy. I could not do it. There has been no prior engagement.
But Isabella became only more and more urgent, calling on her in the most affectionate manner, addressing her by the most endearing names.
She was sure her dearest, sweetest Catherine would not seriously refuse such a trifling request to a friend who loved her so dearly. She knew her beloved Catherine to have so feeling a heart, so sweet a temper, to be so easily persuaded by those she loved.
But all in vain. Catherine felt herself to be in the right, and though pained by such tender, such flattering supplication, could not allow it to influence her. Isabella then tried another method. She reproached her with having more affection for Miss Tilney, though she had known her so little a while, than for her best and oldest friends, with being grown cold and indifferent, in short, towards herself.
I cannot help being jealous, Catherine, when I see myself slighted for strangers, I, who love you so excessively. When once my affections are placed, it is not in the power of anything to change them. But I believe my feelings are stronger than anybody's. I am sure they are too strong for my own peace, and to see myself supplanted in your friendship by strangers does cut me to the quick, I own. These Tilneys seem to swallow up everything else.
Catherine thought this reproach equally strange and unkind. Was it the part of a friend thus to expose her feelings to the notice of others? Isabella appeared to her ungenerous and selfish, regardless of everything but her own gratification. These painful ideas crossed her mind, though she said nothing. Isabella in the meanwhile had applied her handkerchief to her eyes, and Morland, miserable at such a sight, could not help saying,
"Nay, Catherine, I think he cannot stand out any longer now. The sacrifice is not much, and to oblige such a friend, I shall think you quite unkind if you still refuse."
This was the first time of her brother's openly siding against her, and anxious to avoid his displeasure, she proposed a compromise.
If they would only put off their scheme till Tuesday, which they might easily do, as it depended only on themselves, she could go with them, and everybody might then be satisfied.
But
"No, no, no,"
was the immediate answer.
"that could not be. For Thorpe did not know that he might not go to town on Tuesday."
Catherine was sorry, but could do no more, and a short silence ensued, which was broken by Isabella, who in a voice of cold resentment said,
Very well, then there is an end of the party. If Catherine does not go, I cannot. I cannot be the only woman. I would not, upon any account in the world, do so improper a thing.
"Catherine, you must go,"
said James.
But why cannot Mr. Thorpe drive one of his other sisters? I dare say either of them would like to go.
Thank ye,
cried Thorpe.
but I did not come to Bath to drive my sisters about and look like a fool. No, if you do not go, damn me if I do. I only go for the sake of driving you.
That is a compliment which gives me no pleasure.
But her words were lost on Thorpe, who had turned abruptly away. The three others still continued together, walking in a most uncomfortable manner to poor Catherine. Sometimes not a word was said, sometimes she was again attacked with supplications or reproaches, and her arm was still linked within Isabella's, though their hearts were at war. At one moment she was softened, at another irritated, always distressed, but always steady.
"I did not think he had been so obstinate, Catherine,"
said James.
"You were not used to be so hard to persuade. You once were the kindest, best-tempered of my sisters."
I hope I am not less so now.
She replied very feelingly.
But indeed I cannot go. If I am wrong, I am doing what I believe to be right.
I suspect,
said Isabella in a low voice,
there is no great struggle.
Catherine's heart swelled. She drew away her arm, and Isabella made no opposition. Thus passed a long 10 minutes, till they were again joined by Thorpe, who, coming to them with a gayer look, said,
Well, I have settled the matter, and now we may all go to-morrow with a safe conscience. I have been to Miss Tilney and made your excuses.
You have not,
cried Catherine.
I have, upon my soul. Left her this moment. Told her you had sent me to say that, having just recollected a prior engagement of going to Clifton with us to-morrow, you could not have the pleasure of walking with her till Tuesday. She said very well. Tuesday was just as convenient to her. So there is an end of all our difficulties. A pretty good thought of mine, hey?
Isabella's countenance was once more all smiles and good humour, and James too looked happy again.
A most heavenly thought indeed. Now, my sweet Catherine, all our distresses are over. You are honourably acquitted, and we shall have a most delightful party.
This will not do,
said Catherine.
I cannot submit to this. I must run after Miss Tilney directly, and set her right.
Isabella, however, caught hold of one hand, Thorpe of the other, and remonstrances poured in from all three. Even James was quite angry.
"When everything was settled, when Miss Tilney herself said that Tuesday would suit her as well, it was quite ridiculous, quite absurd, to make any further objection."
I do not care. Mr. Thorpe had no business to invent any such message. If I had thought it right to put it off, I could have spoken to Miss Tilney myself. This is only doing it in a ruder way. And how do I know that Mr. Thorpe has? He may be mistaken again, perhaps. He has led me into one act of rudeness by his mistake on Friday. Let me go, Mr. Thorpe. Isabella, do not hold me.
Thorpe told her it would be in vain to go after the Tilneys.
They were turning the corner into Brock Street when he had overtaken them, and were at home by this time.
Then I will go after them,
said Catherine.
Wherever they are, I will go after them. It does not signify talking. If I could not be persuaded into doing what I thought wrong, I never will be tricked into it.
And with these words she broke away and hurried off. Thorpe would have darted after her, but Morland withheld him.
Let her go, if she will go.
She is as obstinate as—
Thorpe never finished the simile, for it could hardly have been a proper one. Away walked Catherine in great agitation, as fast as the crowd would permit her, fearful of being pursued, yet determined to persevere. As she walked, she reflected on what had passed. It was painful to her to disappoint and displease them, particularly to displease her brother, but she could not repent her resistance. Setting her own inclination apart, to have failed a second time in her engagement to Miss Tilney, to have retracted a promise voluntarily made only 5 minutes before, and on a false pretence, too, must have been wrong. She had not been withstanding them on selfish principles alone. She had not consulted merely her own gratification. That might have been ensured in some degree by the excursion itself, by seeing Blaise Castle. No, she had attended to what was due to others, and to her own character, in their opinion. Her conviction of being right, however, was not enough to restore her composure. Till she had spoken to Miss Tilney she could not be at ease, and quickening her pace when she got clear of the crescent, she almost ran over the remaining ground till she gained the top of Milsom Street. So rapid had been her movements that, in spite of the Tilneys' advantage in the outset, they were but just turning into their lodgings as she came within view of them, and the servant still remaining at the open door, she used only the ceremony of saying that
"She must speak with Miss Tilney that moment,"
and hurrying by him, proceeded upstairs. Then, opening the first door before her, which happened to be the right, she immediately found herself in the drawing-room with General Tilney, his son and daughter. Her explanation, defective only in being, from her irritation of nerves and shortness of breath, no explanation at all, was instantly given.
"I am come in a great hurry. It was all a mistake. I never promised to go. I told them from the first I could not go. I ran away in a great hurry to explain it. I did not care what you thought of me. I would not stay for the servant."
The business, however, though not perfectly elucidated by this speech, soon ceased to be a puzzle. Catherine found that John Thorpe had given the message, and Miss Tilney had no scruple in owning herself
greatly surprised by it.
But whether her brother had still exceeded her in resentment, Catherine, though she instinctively addressed herself as much to one as to the other in her vindication, had no means of knowing. Whatever might have been felt before her arrival, her eager declarations immediately made every look and sentence as friendly as she could desire. The affair thus happily settled, she was introduced by Miss Tilney to her father, and received by him with such ready, such solicitous politeness, as recalled Thorpe's information to her mind, and made her think with pleasure that he might be sometimes depended on. To such anxious attention was the General's civility carried, that, not aware of her extraordinary swiftness in entering the house, he was quite angry with the servant, whose neglect had reduced her to open the door of the apartment herself.
What did William mean by it? He should make a point of inquiry into the matter.
And if Catherine had not most warmly asserted his innocence, it seemed likely that William would lose the favour of his master for ever, if not his place, by her rapidity. After sitting with them a quarter of an hour, she rose to take leave, and was then most agreeably surprised by General Tilney's asking her
if she would do his daughter the honour of dining and spending the rest of the day with her.
Miss Tilney added her own wishes. Catherine
was greatly obliged, but it was quite out of her power. Mr. and Mrs. Allen would expect her back any moment.
The General declared
He could say no more. The claims of Mr. and Mrs. Allen were not to be superseded, but on some other day, he trusted, when longer notice could be given, they would not refuse to spare her to her friend.
Oh, no,
Catherine was sure.
They would not have the least objection, and she should have great pleasure in coming.
The General attended her himself to the street door, saying everything gallant as they went downstairs, admiring the elasticity of her walk, which corresponded exactly with the spirit of her dancing, and making her one of the most graceful bows she had ever beheld when they parted. Catherine, delighted by all that had passed, proceeded gaily to Pulteney Street, walking, as she concluded, with great elasticity, though she had never thought of it before. She reached home without seeing anything more of the offended party, and now that she had been triumphant throughout, had carried her point, and was secure of her walk, She began, as the flutter of her spirits subsided, to doubt whether she had been perfectly right. A sacrifice was always noble, and if she had given way to their entreaties, she should have been spared the distressing idea of a friend displeased, a brother angry, and a scheme of great happiness to both destroyed, perhaps through her means. To ease her mind, and ascertain by the opinion of an unprejudiced person what her own conduct had really been, she took occasion to mention before Mr. Allen the half-settled scheme of her brother and the Thorpes for the following day. Mr. Allen caught at it directly.
"Well,"
said he,
"and do you think of going too?"
No, I had just engaged myself to walk with Miss Tilney before they told me of it, and therefore you know I could not go with them, could I?
"No, certainly not, and I am glad you do not think of it. These schemes are not at all the thing. Young men and women driving about the country in open carriages, now and then it is very well. But going to inns and public places together, it is not right, and I wonder Mrs. Thorpe should allow it. I am glad you do not think of going. I am sure Mrs. Morland would not be pleased. Mrs. Allen, are not you of my way of thinking? Do not you think these kind of projects objectionable?"
Yes, very much so indeed. Open carriages are nasty things. A clean gown is not 5 minutes' wear in them. You are splashed getting in and getting out, and the wind takes your hair and your bonnet in every direction. I hate an open carriage myself.
"I know you do, but that is not the question. Do not you think it has an odd appearance if young ladies are frequently driven about in them by young men to whom they are not even related?"
Yes, my dear, a very odd appearance indeed. I cannot bear to see it.
Dear madam,
cried Catherine,
then why did you not tell me so before? I am sure if I had known it to be improper, I would not have gone with Mr. Thorpe at all. But I always hoped you would tell me, if you thought I was doing wrong.
And so I should, my dear, you may depend on it, for as I told Mrs. Morland at parting, I would always do the best for you in my power, but one must not be over particular. Young people will be young people, as your good mother says herself. You know I wanted you, when we first came, not to buy that sprigged muslin, but you would. Young people do not like to be always thwarted.
But this was something of real consequence, and I do not think you would have found me hard to persuade.
"As far as it has gone hitherto, there is no harm done,"
said Mr. Allen.
"and I would only advise you, my dear, not to go out with Mr. Thorpe any more."
That is just what I was going to say,
added his wife. Catherine, relieved for herself, felt uneasy for Isabella, and after a moment's thought asked Mr. Allen
whether it would not be both proper and kind in her to write to Miss Thorpe and explain the indecorum of which she must be as insensible as herself.
For she considered that
Isabella might otherwise perhaps be going to Clifton the next day, in spite of what had passed.
Mr. Allen, however, discouraged her from doing any such thing.
You had better leave her alone, my dear. She is old enough to know what she is about, and if not, has a mother to advise her. Mrs. Thorpe is too indulgent beyond a doubt. But, however, you had better not interfere. She and your brother choose to go, and you will be only getting ill will.
Catherine submitted, and though sorry to think that Isabella should be doing wrong, felt greatly relieved by Mr. Allen's approbation of her own conduct, and truly rejoiced to be preserved by his advice from the danger of falling into such an error herself. Her escape from being one of the party to Clifton was now an escape indeed, for what would the Tilneys have thought of her if she had broken her promise to them in order to do what was wrong in itself, if she had been guilty of one breach of propriety only to enable her to be guilty of another? End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Northanger Abbey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. Chapter 14. The next morning was fair, and Catherine almost expected another attack from the assembled party. With Mr. Allen to support her, she felt no dread of the event, but she would gladly be spared a contest where victory itself was painful, and was heartily rejoiced therefore at neither seeing nor hearing anything of them. The Tilneys called for her at the appointed time, and no new difficulty arising, no sudden recollection, no unexpected summons, no impertinent intrusion to disconcert their measures, my heroine was most unnaturally able to fulfil her engagement, though it was made with the hero himself. They determined on walking round Beechen Cliff, that noble hill whose beautiful verdure and hanging coppice render it so striking an object from almost every opening in Bath.
I never look at it,
said Catherine as they walked along the side of the river,
without thinking of the south of France.
You have been abroad, then?
said Henry, a little surprised.
Oh, no, I only mean what I have read about. It always puts me in mind of the country that Emily and her father travelled through, in The Mysteries of Udolpho. But you never read novels, I dare say?
Why not?
Because they are not clever enough for you. Gentlemen read better books.
The person, be it gentleman or lady, who has not pleasure in a good novel, must be intolerably stupid. I have read all Mrs. Radcliffe's works, and most of them with great pleasure. The Mysteries of Udolpho, when I had once begun it, I could not lay down again. I remember finishing it in 2 days, my hair standing on end the whole time.
Yes,
added Miss Tilney.
and I remember that you undertook to read it aloud to me, and that when I was called away for only 5 minutes to answer a note, instead of waiting for me, you took the volume into the Hermitage Walk, and I was obliged to stay till you had finished it.
Thank you, Eleanor, a most honourable testimony. You see, Miss Morland, the injustice of your suspicions. Here was I, in my eagerness to get on, refusing to wait only 5 minutes for my sister, breaking the promise I had made of reading it aloud, and keeping her in suspense at a most interesting part, by running away with the volume, which, you are to observe, was her own, particularly her own. I am proud when I reflect on it, and I think it must establish me in your good opinion.
I am very glad to hear it indeed, and now I shall never be ashamed of liking Udolpho myself. But I really thought before, young men despised novels amazingly.
It is amazingly. It may well suggest amazement if they do, for they read nearly as many as women. I myself have read hundreds and hundreds. Do not imagine that you can cope with me in a knowledge of Julias and Louisas. If we proceed to particulars, and engage in the never-ceasing enquiry of, have you read this, and have you read that, I shall soon leave you as far behind me as, what shall I say? I want an appropriate simile. As far as your friend Emily herself left poor Valancourt when she went with her aunt into Italy. Consider how many years I have had the start of you. I had entered on my studies at Oxford, while you were a good little girl working your sampler at home.
Not very good, I am afraid. But now, really, do you not think Udolpho the nicest book in the world?
The nicest? By which I suppose you mean the neatest. That must depend on the binding.
Henry,
said Miss Tilney.
you are very impertinent. Miss Morland, he is treating you exactly as he does his sister. He is forever finding fault with me, for some incorrectness of language, and now he is taking the same liberty with you. The word nicest, as you used it, did not suit him, and you had better change it as soon as you can, or we shall be overpowered with Johnson and Blair all the rest of the way.
I am sure,
cried Catherine.
I did not mean to say anything wrong, but it is a nice book, and why should I not call it so?
Very true,
said Henry.
And this is a very nice day, and we are taking a very nice walk, and you are 2 very nice young ladies. Oh, it is a very nice word indeed. It does for everything. Originally, perhaps, it was applied only to express neatness, propriety, delicacy, or refinement. People were nice in their dress, in their sentiments, or their choice. But now every commendation on every subject is comprised in that one word.
While, in fact,
cried his sister,
it ought only to be applied to you, without any commendation at all. You are more nice than wise. Come, Miss Morland, let us leave him to meditate over our faults in the utmost propriety of diction, while we praise Udolpho in whatever terms we like best. It is a most interesting work. You are fond of that kind of reading?
To say the truth, I do not much like any other.
Indeed.
That is, I can read poetry and plays, and things of that sort, and do not dislike travels, but history, real solemn history, I cannot be interested in. Can you?
Yes, I am fond of history.
I wish I were too. I read it a little as a duty, but it tells me nothing that does not either vex or weary me. The quarrels of popes and kings, with wars or pestilences, in every page, the men all so good for nothing, and hardly any women at all. It is very tiresome, and yet I often think it odd that it should be so dull, for a great deal of it must be invention. The speeches that are put into the heroes' mouths, their thoughts and designs, the chief of all this must be invention, and invention is what delights me in other books.
Historians, you think,
said Miss Tilney,
are not happy in their flights of fancy. They display imagination without raising interest. I am fond of history, and am very well contented to take the false with the true. In the principal facts they have sources of intelligence, in former histories and records, which may be as much depended upon, I conclude, as anything that does not actually pass under one's own observation. And as for the little embellishments you speak of, they are embellishments, and I like them as such. If a speech be well drawn up, I read it with pleasure, by whomsoever it may be made, and probably with much greater, if the production of Mr. Hume or Mr. Robertson, than if the genuine words of Caractacus, Agricola, or Alfred the Great.
You are fond of history, and so are Mr. Allen and my father, and I have 2 brothers who do not dislike it. So many instances within my small circle of friends is remarkable. At this rate I shall not pity the writers of history any longer. If people like to read their books, it is all very well, but to be at so much trouble in filling great volumes, which, as I used to think, nobody would willingly ever look into, to be labouring only for the torment of little boys and girls, always struck me as a hard fate, and though I know it is all very right and necessary, I have often wondered at the person's courage that could sit down on purpose to do it.
That little boys and girls should be tormented,
said Henry,
is what no one at all acquainted with human nature in a civilized state can deny. But in behalf of our most distinguished historians, I must observe that they might well be offended at being supposed to have no higher aim, and that, by their method and style, they are perfectly well qualified to torment readers of the most advanced reason and mature time of life. I use the verb to torment, as I observed to be your own method, instead of to instruct, supposing them to be now admitted as synonymous.
You think me foolish to call instruction a torment, but if you had been as much used as myself to hear poor little children first learning their letters and then learning to spell, if you had ever seen how stupid they can be for a whole morning together, and how tired my poor mother is at the end of it, as I am in the habit of seeing almost every day of my life at home, you would allow that to torment and to instruct might sometimes be used as synonymous words.
Very probably. But historians are not accountable for the difficulty of learning to read, and even you yourself, who do not altogether seem particularly friendly to very severe, very intense application, may perhaps be brought to acknowledge that it is very well worth while to be tormented for 2 or 3 years of one's life for the sake of being able to read all the rest of it. Consider, if reading had not been taught, Mrs. Radcliffe would have written in vain, or perhaps might not have written at all.
Catherine assented, and a very warm panegyric from her on that lady's merits closed the subject. The Tilneys were soon engaged on another which she had nothing to say. They were viewing the country with the eyes of persons accustomed to drawing, and decided on its capability of being formed into pictures with all the eagerness of real taste. Here Catherine was quite lost. She knew nothing of drawing, nothing of taste, and she listened to them with an attention which brought her little profit, for they talked in phrases which conveyed scarcely any idea to her. The little which she could understand, however, appeared to contradict the very few notions she had entertained on the matter before. It seemed as if a good view were no longer to be taken from the top of an high hill, and that a clear blue sky was no longer a proof of a fine day. She was heartily ashamed of her ignorance. A misplaced shame. Where people wish to attach, they should always be ignorant. To come with a well-informed mind is to come with an inability of administering to the vanity of others, which a sensible person would always wish to avoid. A woman especially, if she have the misfortune of knowing anything, should conceal it as well as she can. The advantages of natural folly in a beautiful girl have been already set forth by the capital pen of a sister author, and to her treatment of the subject I will only add, in justice to men, that though to the larger and more trifling part of the sex, imbecility in females is a great enhancement of their personal charms, there is a portion of them too reasonable and too well informed themselves to desire anything more in woman than ignorance. But Catherine did not know her own advantages, did not know that a good-looking girl, with an affectionate heart and a very ignorant mind, cannot fail of attracting a clever young man, unless circumstances are particularly untoward. In the present instance, she confessed and lamented her want of knowledge, declared that
she would give anything in the world to be able to draw,
and a lecture on the picturesque immediately followed, in which his instructions were so clear that she soon began to see beauty in everything admired by him, and her attention was so earnest that he became perfectly satisfied of her having a great deal of natural taste. He talked of
foregrounds, distances and second distances, side screens and perspectives, lights and shades.
And Catherine was so hopeful a scholar that when they gained the top of the beechen cliff, she voluntarily rejected the whole city of Bath as
unworthy to make part of a landscape.
Delighted with her progress, and fearful of wearying her with too much wisdom at once, Henry suffered the subject to decline, and by an easy transition from a piece of rocky fragment and the withered oak which he had placed near its summit, to oaks in general, to forests, the enclosure of them, waste lands, crown lands, and government, he shortly found himself arrived at politics, and from politics it was an easy step to silence. The general pause which succeeded his short disquisition on the state of the nation was put an end to by Catherine, who, in a rather solemn tone of voice, uttered these words:
I have heard that something very shocking indeed will soon come out in London.
Miss Tilney, to whom this was chiefly addressed, was startled, and hastily replied,
Indeed? And of what nature?
That I do not know, nor who is the author. I have only heard that it is to be more horrible than anything we have met with yet.
Good heaven! Where could you hear of such a thing?
A particular friend of mine had an account of it in a letter from London yesterday. It is to be uncommonly dreadful. I shall expect murder and everything of the kind.
You speak with astonishing composure. But I hope your friend's accounts have been exaggerated, and if such a design is known beforehand, proper measures will undoubtedly be taken by government to prevent its coming to effect.
Government,
said Henry, endeavouring not to smile,
neither desires nor dares to interfere in such matters. There must be murder, and government cares not how much.
The ladies stared. He laughed and added,
Come, shall I make you understand each other, or leave you to puzzle out an explanation as you can? No, I will be noble. I will prove myself a man, no less by the generosity of my soul than by the clearness of my head. I have no patience with such of my sex as disdain to let themselves sometimes down to the comprehension of yours. Perhaps the abilities of women are neither sound nor acute, neither vigorous nor keen. Perhaps they may want observation, discernment, judgment, fire, genius, and wit.
Miss Morland, do not mind what he says, but have the goodness to satisfy me as to this dreadful riot.
Riot? What riot?
My dear Eleanor, the riot is only in your own brain. The confusion there is scandalous. Miss Morland has been talking of nothing more dreadful than a new publication, which is shortly to come out, in 3 duodecimo volumes, 276 pages in each, with a frontispiece to the first, of 2 tombstones and a lantern. Do you understand? And you, Miss Morland, my stupid sister, has mistaken all your clearest expressions. You talked of expected horrors in London, and instead of instantly conceiving, as any rational creature would have done, that such words could relate only to a circulating library, she immediately pictured to herself a mob of 3,000 men assembling in St. George's Fields, the Bank attacked, the Tower threatened, the streets of London flowing with blood, a detachment of the 12th Light Dragoons, the hopes of the nation, called up from Northampton to quell the insurgents, and the gallant Captain Frederick Tilney, in the moment of charging at the head of his troop, knocked off his horse by a brickbat from an upper window. Forgive her stupidity. The fears of the sister have added to the weakness of the woman, but she is by no means a simpleton in general.
Catherine looked grave.
And now, Henry,
said Miss Tilney,
that you have made us understand each other, you may as well make Miss Morland understand yourself, unless you mean to have her think you intolerably rude to your sister, and a great brute in your opinion of women in general. Miss Morland is not used to your odd ways.
I shall be most happy to make her better acquainted with them.
No doubt, but that is no explanation of the present.
What am I to do?
You know what you ought to do. Clear your character handsomely before her. Tell her that you think very highly of the understanding of women.
Miss Morland, I think very highly of the understanding of all the women in the world, especially of those, whoever they may be, with whom I happen to be in company.
That is not enough. Be more serious.
Miss Morland, no one can think more highly of the understanding of women than I do. In my opinion, nature has given them so much that they never find it necessary to use more than half.
We shall get nothing more serious from him now, Miss Morland. He is not in a sober mood. But I do assure you that he must be entirely misunderstood, if he can ever appear to say an unjust thing of any woman at all, or an unkind one of me.
It was no effort to Catherine to believe that Henry Tilney could never be wrong. His manner might sometimes surprise, but his meaning must always be just, and what she did not understand she was almost as ready to admire as what she did. The whole walk was delightful, and though it ended too soon, its conclusion was delightful too. Her friends attended her into the house, and Miss Tilney, before they parted, addressing herself with respectful form, as much to Mrs. Allen as to Catherine, petitioned for the pleasure of her company to dinner on the day after the next. No difficulty was made on Mrs. Allen's side, and the only difficulty on Catherine's was in concealing the excess of her pleasure. The morning had passed away so charmingly as to banish all her friendship and natural affection, for no thought of Isabella or James had crossed her during their walk. When the Tilneys were gone, she became amiable again, but she was amiable for some time to little effect. Mrs. Allen had no intelligence to give them that could relieve her anxiety. She had heard nothing of any of them. Towards the end of the morning, however, Catherine, having occasion for some indispensable yard of ribbon which must be bought without a moment's delay, walked out into the town, and in Bond Street overtook the second Miss Thorpe as she was loitering toward Edgar's Buildings between two of the sweetest girls in the world who had been her dear friends all the morning. From her she soon learned that the party to Clifton had taken place.
"They set off at 8 this morning,"
said Miss Anne,
"and I am sure I do not envy them their drive. I think you and I are very well off to be out of the scrape. It must be the dullest thing in the world, for there is not a soul at Clifton at this time of year. Belle went with your brother, and John drove Maria."
Catherine spoke the pleasure she really felt on hearing this part of the arrangement.
"Oh, yes,"
rejoined the other.
"Maria is gone. She was quite wild to go. She thought it would be something very fine. I cannot say I admire her taste, and for my part I was determined from the first not to go, if they pressed me ever so much."
Catherine, a little doubtful of this, could not help answering,
"I wish you could have gone too. It is a pity you could not all go."
"Thank you, but it is quite a matter of indifference to me. Indeed, I would not have gone on any account. I was saying so to Emily and Sophia when you overtook us."
Catherine was still unconvinced, but glad that Anne should have the friendship of an Emily and a Sophia to console her. She bade her adieu without much uneasiness, and returned home, pleased that the party had not been prevented by her refusing to join it, and very heartily wishing that it might be too pleasant to allow either James or Isabella to resent her resistance any longer. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Northanger Abbey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, Chapter 15. Early the next day a note from Isabella, speaking peace and tenderness in every line, and entreating the immediate presence of her friend on a matter of the utmost importance, hastened Catherine, in the happiest state of confidence and curiosity, to Edgar's Buildings. The two youngest Miss Thorpes were by themselves in the parlour, and, on Anne's quitting it to call her sister, Catherine took the opportunity of asking the other for some particulars of their yesterday's party. Maria desired no greater pleasure than to speak of it, and Catherine immediately learnt that
it had been altogether the most delightful scheme in the world, that nobody could imagine how charming it had been, and that it had been more delightful than anybody could conceive.
Such was the information of the first 5 minutes. The second unfolded thus much in detail:
that they had driven directly to the York Hotel, ate some soup and bespoke an early dinner, walked down to the pump-room, tasted the water, and laid out some shillings in purses and spars, then sojourned to eat ice at a pastry-cook's, and hurrying back to the hotel, swallowed their dinner in haste, to prevent being in the dark, and then had a delightful drive back, only the moon was not up, and it rained a little, and Mr. Morland's horse was so tired he could hardly get it along.
Catherine listened with heartfelt satisfaction. It appeared that Blaise Castle had never been thought of, and as for all the rest, there was nothing to regret for half an instant. Maria's intelligence concluded with a tender effusion of pity for her sister Anne, whom she represented as insupportably cross from being excluded the party.
"She will never forgive me, I am sure, but, you know, how could I help it? John would have me go, for he vowed he would not drive her, because she had such thick ankles. I dare say she will not be in good humour again this month, but I am determined I will not be cross. It is not a little matter that puts me out of temper."
Isabella now entered the room with so eager a step and a look of such happy importance as engaged all her friend's notice. Maria was, without ceremony, sent away, and Isabella, embracing Catherine, thus began.
"Yes, my dear Catherine, it is so indeed. Your penetration has not deceived you. Oh, that arch eye of yours! It sees through everything."
Catherine replied only by a look of wondering ignorance.
"Nay, my beloved, my sweetest friend,"
continued the other,
"compose yourself. I am amazingly agitated, as you perceive. Let us sit down and talk in comfort. Well, and so you guessed it the moment you had my note? Sly creature! Oh, my dear Catherine, you alone, who know my heart, can judge of my present happiness. Your brother is the most charming of men. I only wish I were more worthy of him. But what will your excellent father and mother say? Oh, heavens! When I think of them, I am so agitated."
Catherine's understanding began to awake. An idea of the truth suddenly darted into her mind, and, with the natural blush of so new an emotion, she cried out,
"Good heaven! My dear Isabella, what do you mean? Can you really be in love with James?"
This bold surmise, however, she soon learnt comprehended but half the fact. The anxious affection which she was accused of having continually watched in Isabella's every look and action, had, in the course of their yesterday's party, received the delightful confession of an equal love. Her heart and faith were alike engaged to James. Never had Catherine listened to anything so full of interest, wonder, and joy. Her brother and her friend engaged! New to such circumstances, the importance of it appeared unspeakably great, and she contemplated it as one of those grand events of which the ordinary course of life can hardly afford a return. The strength of her feelings she could not express. The nature of them, however, contented her friend. The happiness of having such a sister was their first effusion, and the fair ladies mingled in embraces and tears of joy. Delighting, however, as Catherine sincerely did in the prospect of the connection, it must be acknowledged that Isabella far surpassed her in tender anticipations.
"You will be so infinitely dearer to me, my Catherine, than either Anne or Maria. I feel that I shall be so much more attached to my dear Morland's family than to my own."
This was a pitch of friendship beyond Catherine.
"You are so like your dear brother,"
continued Isabella,
"that I quite doted on you the first moment I saw you. But so it always is with me. The first moment settles everything. The very first day that Morland came to us last Christmas, the very first moment I beheld him, my heart was irrecoverably gone. I remember I wore my yellow gown with my hair done up in braids, and when I came into the drawing-room and John introduced him, I thought I never saw anybody so handsome before."
Here Catherine secretly acknowledged the power of love, for though exceedingly fond of her brother, and partial to all his endowments, she had never in her life thought him handsome.
I remember, too, Miss Andrews drank tea with us that evening, and wore her puce-coloured sarcenet, and she looked so heavenly that I thought your brother must certainly fall in love with her. I could not sleep a wink all night for thinking of it. Oh, Catherine, the many sleepless nights I have had on your brother's account! I would not have you suffer half what I have done. I am grown wretchedly thin, I know, but I will not pain you by describing my anxiety. You have seen enough of it. I feel that I have betrayed myself perpetually, so unguarded in speaking of my partiality for the Church, but my secret I was always sure would be safe with you."
Catherine felt that nothing could have been safer, but ashamed of an ignorance little expected, she dared no longer contest the point, nor refuse to have been as full of arch penetration and affectionate sympathy as Isabella chose to consider her. Her brother, she found, was preparing to set off with all speed to Fullerton, to make known his situation and ask consent, and here was a source of some real agitation to the mind of Isabella. Catherine endeavoured to persuade her, as she was herself persuaded, that her father and mother would never oppose their son's wishes.
"It is impossible,"
said she,
"for parents to be more kind or more desirous of their children's happiness. I have no doubt of their consenting immediately."
"Morland says exactly the same,"
replied Isabella,
"and yet I dare not expect it. My fortune will be so small, they never can consent to it. Your brother, who might marry anybody."
Here Catherine again discerned the force of love.
"Indeed, Isabella, you are too humble. The difference of fortune can be nothing to signify."
Oh, my sweet Catherine, in your generous heart I know it would signify nothing, but we must not expect such disinterestedness in many. As for myself, I am sure I only wish our situations were reversed. Had I the command of millions, were I mistress of the whole world, your brother would be my only choice.
This charming sentiment, recommended as much by sense as novelty, gave Catherine a most pleasing remembrance of all the heroines of her acquaintance, and she thought her friend never looked more lovely than in uttering the grand idea.
I am sure they will consent,
was her frequent declaration.
I am sure they will be delighted with you.
For my own part,
said Isabella,
my wishes are so moderate that the smallest income in nature would be enough for me. Where people are really attached, poverty itself is wealth. Grandeur I detest. I would not settle in London for the universe. A cottage in some retired village would be ecstasy. There are some charming little villas about Richmond.
Richmond?
cried Catherine.
You must settle near Fullerton. You must be near us.
I am sure I shall be miserable if we do not. If I can but be near you, I shall be satisfied. But this is idle talking. I will not allow myself to think of such things till we have your father's answer. Morland says that by sending it to-night to Salisbury, we may have it to-morrow. To-morrow! I know I shall never have the courage to open the letter. I know it will be the death of me.
A reverie succeeded this conviction, and when Isabella spoke again, it was to resolve on the quality of her wedding gown. Their conference was put an end to by the anxious young lover himself, who came to breathe his parting sigh before he set off for Wiltshire. Catherine wished to congratulate him, but knew not what to say, and her eloquence was only in her eyes. From them, however, the 8 parts of speech shone out most expressively, and James could combine them with ease. Impatient for the realization of all that he hoped at home, his adieus were not long, and they would have been yet shorter had he not been frequently detained by the urgent entreaties of his fair one that he would go. Twice he was called almost from the door by her eagerness to have him gone.
Indeed, Morland, I must drive you away. Consider how far you have to ride. I cannot bear to see you linger so. For heaven's sake, waste no more time. There, go, go. I insist on it.
The two friends, with hearts now more united than ever, were inseparable for the day, and in schemes of sisterly happiness the hours flew along. Mrs. Thorpe and her son, who were acquainted with everything, and who seemed only to want Mr. Morland's consent, to consider Isabella's engagement as the most fortunate circumstance imaginable for their family, were allowed to join their counsels, and add their quota of significant looks and mysterious expressions to fill up the measure of curiosity to be raised in the unprivileged younger sisters. To Catherine's simple feelings, this odd sort of reserve seemed neither kindly meant nor consistently supported, and its unkindness she would hardly have forborne pointing out, had its inconsistency been less their friend. But Anne and Maria soon set her heart at ease by the sagacity of their I know what, and the evening was spent in a sort of war of wit, a display of family ingenuity, on one side in the mystery of an affected secret, on the other of undefined discovery, all equally acute. Catherine was with her friend again the next day, endeavouring to support her spirits and while away the many tedious hours before the delivery of the letters. A needful exertion, for as the time of reasonable expectation drew near, Isabella became more and more desponding, and before the letter arrived, had worked herself into a state of real distress. But when it did come, where could distress be found?
I have had no difficulty in gaining the consent of my kind parents, and am promised that everything in their power shall be done to forward my happiness,
were the first 3 lines, and in one moment all was joyful security. The brightest glow was instantly spread over Isabella's features. All care and anxiety seemed removed, her spirits became almost too high for control, and she called herself without scruple
the happiest of mortals.
Mrs. Thorpe, with tears of joy, embraced her daughter, her son, her visitor, and could have embraced half the inhabitants of Bath with satisfaction. Her heart was overflowing with tenderness. It was
"Dear John,"
and
"Dear Catherine,"
at every word.
"Dear Anne," and "Dear Maria,"
must immediately be made sharers in their felicity, and 2 dears at once before the name of Isabella were not more than that beloved child had now well earned. John himself was no skulker in joy. He not only bestowed on Mr. Morland the high commendation of being
one of the finest fellows in the world,
but swore off many sentences in his praise. The letter whence sprang all this felicity was short, containing little more than this assurance of success, and every particular was deferred till James could write again. But for particulars Isabella could well afford to wait. The needful was comprised in Mr. Morland's promise. His honour was pledged to make everything easy, and by what means their income was to be formed, whether landed property were to be resigned or funded money made over, was a matter in which her disinterested spirit took no concern. She knew enough to feel secure of an honourable and speedy establishment, and her imagination took a rapid flight over its attendant felicities. She saw herself, at the end of a few weeks, the gaze and admiration of every new acquaintance at Fullerton, the envy of every valued old friend in Putney, with a carriage at her command, a new name on her tickets, and a brilliant exhibition of hoop rings on her finger. When the contents of the letter were ascertained, John Thorpe, who had only waited its arrival to begin his journey to London, prepared to set off.
"Well, Miss Morland,"
said he, on finding her alone in the parlour,
"I am come to bid you good-bye."
Catherine wished him a good journey. Without appearing to hear her, he walked to the window, fidgeted about, hummed a tune, and seemed wholly self-occupied.
"Shall not you be late at Devizes?"
said Catherine. He made no answer, but after a minute's silence burst out with,
"A famous good thing, this marrying scheme, upon my soul. A clever fancy of Morland's and Bell's. What do you think of it, Miss Morland? I say it is no bad notion."
"I am sure I think it a very good one."
"Do you? That's honest, by heavens! I'm glad you are no enemy to matrimony, however. Did you ever hear the old song, 'Going to one wedding brings on another'? I say, you will come to Bell's wedding, I hope?"
"Yes, I have promised your sister to be with her, if possible."
"And then, you know,"
twisting himself about and forcing a foolish laugh,
"I say, then, you know, we may try the truth of this same old song."
"May we? But I never sing. Well, I wish you a good journey. I dine with Miss Tilney to-day, and must now be going home."
"Nay, there's no such confounded hurry. Who knows when we may be together again? Not but that I shall be down again by the end of a fortnight, and a devilish long fortnight it will appear to me."
"Then why do you stay away so long?"
replied Catherine, finding that he waited for an answer.
"That is kind of you, however. Kind and good-natured. I shall not forget it in a hurry. But you have more good nature and all that than anybody living, I believe. A monstrous deal of good nature. And it is not only good nature, but you have so much of everything. And then you have such... Upon my soul, I do not know anybody like you."
"Oh, dear, there are a great many people like me, I dare say, only a great deal better. Good morning to you."
"But I say, Miss Morland, I shall come and pay my respects at Fullerton before it is long, if not disagreeable."
"Pray do. My father and mother will be very glad to see you."
"And I hope, Miss Morland, you will not be sorry to see me."
"Oh dear, not at all. There are very few people I am sorry to see. Company is always cheerful."
"That is just my way of thinking. Give me but a little cheerful company. Let me only have the company of the people I love. Let me only be where I like, and with whom I like, and the devil take the rest, say I. And I am heartily glad to hear you say the same. But I have a notion, Miss Morland, you and I think pretty much alike upon most matters."
"Perhaps we may, but it is more than I ever thought of. And as to most matters, to say the truth, there are not many that I know my own mind about."
"By Jove, no more do I. It is not my way to bother my brains with what does not concern me. My notion of things is simple enough. Let me only have the girl I like, say I, with a comfortable house over my head, and what care I for all the rest? Fortune is nothing. I'm sure of a good income of my own, and if she had not a penny, why, so much the better."
"Very true. I think like you there. If there is a good fortune on one side, there can be no occasion for any on the other, no matter which has it, so that there is enough. I hate the idea of one great fortune looking out for another, and to marry for money I think the wickedest thing in existence. Good day. We shall be very glad to see you at Fullerton, whenever it is convenient."
And away she went. It was not in the power of all his gallantry to detain her longer. With such news to communicate and such a visit to prepare for, her departure was not to be delayed by anything in his nature to urge, and she hurried away, leaving him to the undivided consciousness of his own happy address and her explicit encouragement. The agitation which she had herself experienced on first learning her brother's engagement made her expect to raise no inconsiderable emotion in Mr. and Mrs. Allen by the communication of the wonderful event. How great was her disappointment! The important affair, which many words of preparation ushered in, had been foreseen by them both ever since her brother's arrival, and all that they felt on the occasion was comprehended in a wish for the young people's happiness, with a remark on the gentleman's side in favour of
Isabella's beauty,
and on the lady's of
her great good luck.
It was to Catherine the most surprising insensibility. The disclosure, however, of the great secret of James's going to Fullerton the day before did raise some emotion in Mrs. Allen. She could not listen to that with perfect calmness, but repeatedly regretted the necessity of its concealment, wished she could have known his intention, wished she could have seen him before he went, as
she should certainly have troubled him, with her best regards to his father and mother, and her kind compliments to all the Skinners.
End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Northanger Abbey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, Chapter 16. Catherine's expectations of pleasure from her visit in Milsom Street were so very high that disappointment was inevitable, and accordingly, though she was most politely received by General Tilney and kindly welcomed by his daughter, though Henry was at home and no one else of the party, she found on her return, without spending many hours in the examination of her feelings, that she had gone to her appointment preparing for happiness which it had not afforded. Instead of finding herself improved in acquaintance with Miss Tilney from the intercourse of the day, she seemed hardly so intimate with her as before. Instead of seeing Henry Tilney to greater advantage than ever in the ease of a family party, he had never said so little, nor been so little agreeable, and, in spite of their father's great civilities to her, in spite of his thanks, invitations, and compliments, it had been a release to get away from him. It puzzled her to account for all this. It could not be General Tilney's fault. That he was perfectly agreeable and good-natured, and altogether a very charming man, did not admit of a doubt, for he was tall and handsome, and Henry's father. He could not be accountable for his children's want of spirits, or for her want of enjoyment in his company. The former she hoped at last might have been accidental, and the latter she could only attribute to her own stupidity. Isabella, on hearing the particulars of the visit, gave a different explanation.
It was all pride, insufferable haughtiness, and pride. She had long suspected the family to be very high, and this made it certain. Such insolence of behaviour as Miss Tilney's she had never heard of in her life. Not to do the honours of her house with common good breeding, to behave to her guest with such superciliousness, hardly even to speak to her.
But it was not so bad as that, Isabella. There was no superciliousness. She was very civil.
Oh, don't defend her. And then the brother, he who had appeared so attached to you, good heavens! Well, some people's feelings are incomprehensible, and so he hardly looked once at you the whole day.
I do not say so, but he did not seem in good spirits.
How contemptible! Of all things in the world, inconstancy is my aversion. Let me entreat you never to think of him again, my dear Catherine. Indeed, he is unworthy of you.
Unworthy? I do not suppose he ever thinks of me.
That is exactly what I say. He never thinks of you. Such fickleness! Oh, how different to your brother and to mine! I really believe John has the most constant heart.
But as for General Tilney, I assure you it would be impossible for anybody to behave to me with greater civility and attention. It seemed to be his only care to entertain me and make me happy.
Oh, I know no harm of him. I do not suspect him of pride. I believe he is a very gentlemanlike man. John thinks very well of him, and John's judgment—
Well, I shall see how they behave to me this evening. We shall meet them at the rooms.
And must I go?
Do not you intend it? I thought it was all settled.
Nay, since you make such a point of it, I can refuse you nothing. But do not insist upon my being very agreeable, for my heart, you know, will be some 40 miles off. And as for dancing, do not mention it, I beg. That is quite out of the question. Charles Hodges will plague me to death, I dare say, but I shall cut him very short. 10 to 1, but he guesses the reason, and that is exactly what I want to avoid, so I shall insist on his keeping his conjecture to himself.
Isabella's opinion of the Tilneys did not influence her friend. She was sure there had been no insolence in the manners either of brother or sister, and she did not credit there being any pride in their hearts. The evening rewarded her confidence. She was met by one with the same kindness, and by the other with the same attention as heretofore. Miss Tilney took pains to be near her, and Henry asked her to dance. Having heard the day before in Milsom Street that their elder brother, Captain Tilney, was expected almost every hour, she was at no loss for the name of a very fashionable-looking, handsome young man whom she had never seen before, and who now evidently belonged to their party. She looked at him with great admiration, and even supposed it possible that some people might think him handsomer than his brother, though in her eyes his air was more assuming and his countenance less prepossessing. His taste and manners were beyond a doubt decidedly inferior, for within her hearing he not only protested against every thought of dancing himself, but even laughed openly at Henry for finding it possible. From the latter circumstance it may be presumed that, whatever might be our heroine's opinion of him, his admiration of her was not of a very dangerous kind, not likely to produce animosities between the brothers, nor persecutions to the lady. He cannot be the instigator of the 3 villains in horsemen's greatcoats, by whom she will hereafter be forced into a travelling chaise and 4, which will drive off with incredible speed. Catherine, meanwhile, undisturbed by presentiments of such an evil, or of any evil at all, except that of having but a short set to dance down, enjoyed her usual happiness with Henry Tilney, listening with sparkling eyes to everything he said, and, in finding him irresistible, becoming so herself. At the end of the first dance, Captain Tilney came towards them again, and, much to Catherine's dissatisfaction, pulled his brother away. They retired whispering together, and though her delicate sensibility did not take immediate alarm, and lay it down as fact that Captain Tilney must have heard some malevolent misrepresentation of her, which he now hastened to communicate to his brother in the hope of separating them for ever, she could not have her partner conveyed from her sight without very uneasy sensations. Her suspense was of full 5 minutes' duration, and she was beginning to think it a very long quarter of an hour when they both returned, and an explanation was given by Henry's requesting to know
if she thought her friend, Miss Thorpe, would have any objection to dancing, as his brother would be most happy to be introduced to her.
Catherine, without hesitation, replied that
she was very sure that Miss Thorpe did not mean to dance at all.
The cruel reply was passed on to the other, and he immediately walked away.
Your brother will not mind, I know,
said she,
because I heard him say before that he hated dancing, but it was very good-natured in him to think of it. I suppose he saw Isabella sitting down, and fancied she might wish for a partner, but he is quite mistaken, for she would not dance upon any account in the world.
Henry smiled and said,
How very little trouble it can give you to understand the motive of other people's actions.
Why, what do you mean?
With you it is not, how is such a one likely to be influenced? What is the inducement most likely to act upon such a person's feelings, age, situation, and probable habits of life considered? But how should I be influenced? What will be my inducement in acting so and so?
I do not understand you.
Then we are on very unequal terms, for I understand you perfectly well.
Me? Yes, I cannot speak well enough to be unintelligible.
Bravo! An excellent satire on modern language.
But pray tell me what you mean.
Shall I indeed? Do you really desire it? But you are not aware of the consequences. It will involve you in a very cruel embarrassment, and certainly bring on a disagreement between us.
No, no, it shall not do either. I am not afraid.
Well, then, I only meant that your attributing my brother's wish of dancing with Miss Thorpe to good nature alone convinced me of your being superior in good nature yourself to all the rest of the world.
Catherine blushed and disclaimed, and the gentleman's predictions were verified. There was a something, however, in his words which repaid her for the pain of confusion, and that something occupied her mind so much that she drew back for some time, forgetting to speak or to listen, and almost forgetting where she was, till, roused by the voice of Isabella, she looked up and saw her with Captain Tilney preparing to give them hands across. Isabella shrugged her shoulders and smiled, the only explanation of this extraordinary change which could at that time be given. But as it was not quite enough for Catherine's comprehension, she spoke her astonishment in very plain terms to her partner.
I cannot think how it could happen. Isabella was so determined not to dance.
And did Isabella never change her mind before?
Oh, but because... And your brother. After what you told him from me, how could he think of going to ask her?
I cannot take surprise to myself on that head. You bid me be surprised on your friend's account, and therefore I am. But as for my brother, his conduct in the business, I must own, has been no more than I believed him perfectly equal to. The fairness of your friend was an open attraction. Her firmness, you know, could only be understood by yourself.
You are laughing, but I assure you Isabella is very firm in general.
It is as much as should be said of anyone. To be always firm must be to be often obstinate. When properly to relax is the trial of judgment, and without reference to my brother, I really think Miss Thorpe has by no means chosen ill in fixing on the present hour.
The friends were not able to get together for any confidential discourse till all the dancing was over, but then, as they walked about the room arm in arm, Isabella thus explained herself.
I do not wonder at your surprise, and I am really fatigued to death. He is such a rattle, amusing enough if my mind had been disengaged, but I would have given the world to sit still.
Then why did not you?
Oh, my dear, it would have looked so particular, and you know how I abhor doing that. I refused him as long as I possibly could, but he would take no denial. You have no idea how he pressed me. I begged him to excuse me and get some other partner, but no, not he. After aspiring to my hand, there was nobody else in the room he could bear to think of, and it was not that he wanted merely to dance, he wanted to be with me. Oh, such nonsense! I told him he had taken a very unlikely way to prevail upon me, for of all things in the world I hated fine speeches and compliments, and so then I found there would be no peace if I did not stand up. Besides, I thought Mrs. Hughes, who introduced him, might take it ill if I did not, and your dear brother, I am sure he would have been miserable if I had sat down the whole evening. I am so glad it is over. My spirits are quite jaded with listening to his nonsense, and then, being such a smart young fellow, I saw every eye was upon us.
He is very handsome indeed.
Handsome, yes, I suppose he may. I dare say people would admire him in general, but he is not at all in my style of beauty. I hate a florid complexion and dark eyes in a man. However, he is very well. Amazingly conceited, I am sure. I took him down several times, you know, in my way.
When the young ladies next met, they had a far more interesting subject to discuss. James Morland's second letter was then received, and the kind intentions of his father fully explained. A living, of which Mr. Morland was himself patron and incumbent, of about £400 yearly value, was to be resigned to his son as soon as he should be old enough to take it. No trifling deduction from the family income, no niggardly assignment to one of 10 children. An estate of at least equal value, moreover, was assured as his future inheritance. James expressed himself on the occasion with becoming gratitude, and the necessity of waiting between 2 and 3 years before they could marry being, however unwelcome, no more than he had expected, was borne by him without discontent. Catherine, whose expectations had been as unfixed as her ideas of her father's income, and whose judgment was now entirely led by her brother, felt equally well satisfied, and heartily congratulated Isabella on having everything so pleasantly settled.
It is very charming indeed,
said Isabella with a grave face.
Mr. Morland has behaved vastly handsome indeed,
said the gentle Mrs. Thorpe, looking anxiously at her daughter.
I only wish I could do as much. One could not expect more from him, you know. If he finds he can do more by and by, I dare say he will, for I am sure he must be an excellent good-hearted man. 400 is but a small income to begin on, indeed, but your wishes, my dear Isabella, are so moderate, you do not consider how little you ever want, my dear.
It is not on my own account I wish for more, but I cannot bear to be the means of injuring my dear Morland, making him sit down upon an income hardly enough to find one in the common necessaries of life. For myself it is nothing. I never think of myself.
I know you never do, my dear, and you will always find your reward in the affection it makes everybody feel for you. There never was a young woman so beloved as you are by everybody that knows you. And I dare say when Mr. Morland sees you, my dear child, but do not let us distress our dear Catherine by talking of such things. Mr. Morland has behaved so very handsome. You know I always heard he was a most excellent man, and you know, my dear, we are not to suppose, but what if you had a suitable fortune, he would have come down with something more, for I am sure he must be a most liberal-minded man.
Nobody can think better of Mr. Morland than I do, I am sure, but everybody has their failing, you know, and everybody has a right to do what they like with their own money.
Catherine was hurt by these insinuations.
I am very sure,
said she,
that my father has promised to do as much as he can afford.
Isabella recollected herself.
As to that, my sweet Catherine, there cannot be a doubt, and you know me well enough to be sure that a much smaller income would satisfy me. It is not the want of more money that makes me just at present a little out of spirits. I hate money, and if our union could take place now upon only £50 a year, I should not have a wish unsatisfied. Ah, my Catherine, you have found me out. There's the sting, the long, long, endless 2 years and half that are to pass before your brother can hold the living.
Yes, yes, my darling Isabella,
said Mrs. Thorpe.
We perfectly see into your heart. You have no disguise. We perfectly understand the present vexation, and everybody must love you the better for such a noble, honest affection.
Catherine's uncomfortable feelings began to lessen. She endeavoured to believe that the delay of the marriage was the only source of Isabella's regret, and when she saw her at their next interview as cheerful and amiable as ever, endeavoured to forget that she had for a minute thought otherwise. James soon followed his letter, and was received with the most gratifying kindness. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Northanger Abbey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, Chapter 17. The Allens had now entered on the 6th week of their stay in Bath, and whether it should be the last was for some time a question to which Catherine listened with a beating heart. To have her acquaintance with the Tilneys end so soon was an evil which nothing could counterbalance. Her whole happiness seemed at stake, while the affair was in suspense, and everything secured when it was determined that the lodging should be taken for another fortnight. What this additional fortnight was to produce to her, beyond the pleasure of sometimes seeing Henry Tilney, made but a small part of Catherine's speculation. Once or twice, indeed, since James's engagement had taught her what could be done, she had got so far as to indulge in a secret perhaps. But in general the felicity of being with him for the present bounded her views. The present was now comprised in another 3 weeks, and her happiness being certain for that period, the rest of her life was at such a distance as to excite but little interest. In the course of the morning which saw this business arranged, she visited Miss Tilney, and poured forth her joyful feelings. It was doomed to be a day of trial. No sooner had she expressed her delight in Mr. Allen's lengthened stay than Miss Tilney told her of her
father's having just determined upon quitting Bath by the end of another week.
Here was a blow. The past suspense of the morning had been ease and quiet to the present disappointment. Catherine's countenance fell, and in a voice of most sincere concern she echoed Miss Tilney's concluding words.
By the end of another week?
Yes, my father can seldom be prevailed on to give the waters what I think a fair trial. He has been disappointed of some friend's arrival, whom he expected to meet here, and as he is now pretty well, is in a hurry to get home.
I am very sorry for it,
said Catherine dejectedly.
If I had known this before.
Perhaps,
said Miss Tilney in an embarrassed manner,
you would be so good. It would make me very happy if...
The entrance of her father put a stop to the civility which Catherine was beginning to hope might introduce a desire of their corresponding. After addressing her with his usual politeness, he turned to his daughter and said,
Well, Eleanor, may I congratulate you on being successful in your application to your fair friend?
I was just beginning to make the request, sir, as you came in.
Well, proceed by all means. I know how much your heart is in it. My daughter, Miss Morland,"
he continued, without leaving his daughter time to speak,
"has been forming a very bold wish. We leave Bath, as she has perhaps told you, on Saturday se'nnight. A letter from my steward tells me that my presence is wanted at home, and being disappointed in my hope of seeing the Marquis of Longtown and General Courtenay here, some of my very old friends, there is nothing to detain me longer in Bath. And could we carry out Selfridge Point with you, we should leave it without a single regret. Can you, in short, be prevailed on to quit this scene of public triumph, and oblige your friend Eleanor with your company in Gloucestershire? I am almost ashamed to make the request, though its presumption would certainly appear greater to every creature in Bath than yourself. Modesty such as yours, but not for the world would I paint it by open praise. If you can be induced to honour us with a visit, you will make us happy beyond expression. 'Tis true, we can offer you nothing like the gaieties of this lively place. We can tempt you neither by amusement nor splendour, for our mode of living, as you say, is plain and unpretending. Yet no endeavour shall be wanting on our side to make Northanger Abbey not wholly disagreeable."
Northanger Abbey! These were thrilling words, and wound up Catherine's feelings to the highest point of ecstasy. Her grateful and gratified heart could hardly restrain its expressions within the language of tolerable calmness. To receive so flattering an invitation, to have her company so warmly solicited, everything honourable and soothing, every present enjoyment and every future hope was contained in it, and her acceptance, with only the saving clause of papa and mamma's approbation, was eagerly given.
"I will write home directly,"
said she,
"and if they do not object, as I dare say they will not."
General Tilney was not less sanguine, having already waited on her excellent friends in Pulteney Street, and obtained their sanction of his wishes.
"Since they can consent to part with you,"
said he,
"we may expect philosophy from all the world."
Miss Tilney was earnest, though gentle, in her secondary civilities, and the affair became in a few minutes as nearly settled as this necessary reference to Fullerton would allow. The circumstances of the morning had led Catherine's feelings through the varieties of suspense, security, and disappointment, but they were now safely lodged in perfect bliss, and with the spirits elated to rapture, with Henry at her heart, and Northanger Abbey on her lips, she hurried home to write her letter. Mr. and Mrs. Morland, relying on the discretion of the friends to whom they had already entrusted their daughter, felt no doubt of the propriety of an acquaintance which had been formed under their eye, and sent therefore by return of post their ready consent to her visit in Gloucestershire. This indulgence, though not more than Catherine had hoped for, completed her conviction of being favoured beyond every other human creature in friends and fortune, circumstance and chance. Everything seemed to cooperate for her advantage. By the kindness of her first friends, the Allens, she had been introduced into scenes where pleasures of every kind had met her. Her feelings, her preferences, had each known the happiness of a return. Wherever she felt attachment, she had been able to create it. The affection of Isabella was to be secured to her in a sister. The Tilneys, they by whom, above all, she desired to be favourably thought of, outstripped even her wishes in the flattering measures by which their intimacy was to be continued. She was to be their chosen visitor. She was to be for weeks under the same roof with the person whose society she most prized, and, in addition to all the rest, this roof was to be the roof of an abbey. Her passion for ancient edifices was next in degree to her passion for Henry Tilney, and castles and abbeys made usually the charm of those reveries which his image did not fill. To see and explore either the ramparts and keep of the one, or the cloisters of the other, had been for many weeks a darling wish, though to be more than the visitor of an hour had seemed too nearly impossible for desire. And yet this was to happen, with all the chances against her of house, hall, place, park, court, and cottage. Northanger turned up an abbey, and she was to be its inhabitant. Its long damp passages, its narrow cells and ruined chapel were to be within her daily reach, and she could not entirely subdue the hope of some traditional legends, some awful memorials of an injured and ill-fated nun. It was wonderful that her friend should seem so little elated by the possession of such a home, that the consciousness of it should be so meekly borne. The power of early habit only could account for it. A distinction to which they had been born gave no pride. Their superiority of abode was no more to them than their superiority of person. Many were the inquiries she was eager to make of Miss Tilney, but so active were her thoughts that when these inquiries were answered she was hardly more assured than before of Northanger Abbey having been a richly endowed convent at the time of the Reformation, of its having fallen into the hands of an ancestor of the Tilneys on its dissolution, of a large portion of the ancient building still making a part of the present dwelling, although the rest was decayed, or of its standing low in a valley sheltered from the north and east by rising woods of oak. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Northanger Abbey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, Chapter 18. With a mind thus full of happiness, Catherine was hardly aware that 2 or 3 days had passed away without her seeing Isabella for more than a few minutes together. She began first to be sensible of this, and to sigh for her conversation, as she walked along the pump-room one morning by Mrs. Allen's side, without anything to say or to hear, and scarcely had she felt a 5 minutes' longing of friendship before the object of it appeared, and, inviting her to a secret conference, led the way to a seat.
"This is my favourite place,"
said she, as they sat down on a bench between the doors, which commanded a tolerable view of everybody entering at either.
"It is so out of the way."
Catherine, observing that Isabella's eyes were continually bent towards one door or the other, as in eager expectation, and remembering how often she had been falsely accused of being arch, thought the present a fine opportunity for being really so, and therefore gaily said,
"Do not be uneasy, Isabella. James will soon be here."
"Pshaw, my dear creature,"
she replied.
"Do not think me such a simpleton as to be always wanting to confine him to my elbow. It would be hideous to be always together. We should be the jest of the place. And so you are going to Northanger. I am amazingly glad of it. It is one of the finest old places in England, I understand. I shall depend upon a most particular description of it."
"You shall certainly have the best in my power to give. But who are you looking for? Are your sisters coming?"
"I am not looking for anybody. One's eyes must be somewhere, and you know what a foolish trick I have of fixing mine when my thoughts are 100 miles off. I am amazingly absent. I believe I am the most absent creature in the world. Tilney says it is always the case with minds of a certain stamp."
"But I thought, Isabella, you had something in particular to tell me."
"Oh, yes, and so I have. But here is a proof of what I was saying. My poor head, I had quite forgot it. Well, the thing is this. I have just had a letter from John. You can guess the contents."
"No, indeed, I cannot."
"My sweet love, do not be so abominably affected. What can he write about but yourself? You know he is over head and ears in love with you."
"With me, dear Isabella?"
"Nay, my sweetest Catherine, this is being quite absurd. Modesty and all that is very well in its way, but really a little common honesty is sometimes quite as becoming. I have no idea of being so overstrained. It is fishing for compliments. His attentions were such as a child must have noticed, and it was but half an hour before he left Bath that you gave him the most positive encouragement. He says so in this letter, says that he as good as made you an offer, and that you received his advances in the kindest way, and now he wants me to urge his suit, and say all manner of pretty things to you, so it is in vain to affect ignorance."
Catherine, with all the earnestness of truth, expressed her astonishment at such a charge, protesting her innocence of every thought of Mr. Thorpe's being in love with her, and the consequent impossibility of her having ever intended to encourage him.
"As to any attentions on his side, I do declare, upon my honour, I never was sensible of them for a moment, except just his asking me to dance the first day of his coming. And as to making me an offer, or anything like it, there must be some unaccountable mistake. I could not have misunderstood a thing of that kind, you know. and as I ever wish to be believed, I solemnly protest that no syllable of such a nature ever passed between us. The last half-hour before he went away, it must be all and completely a mistake, for I did not see him once that whole morning.
But that you certainly did, for you spent the whole morning in Edgar's Buildings. It was the day your father's consent came, and I am pretty sure that you and John were alone in the parlour some time before you left the house.
Are you? Well, if you say it, it was so, I dare say, but for the life of me I cannot recollect it. I do remember now being with you, and seeing him as well as the rest, but that we were ever alone for 5 minutes. However, it is not worth arguing about, for whatever might pass on his side, you must be convinced, by my having no recollection of it, that I never thought, nor expected, nor wished for anything of the kind from him. I am excessively concerned that he should have any regard for me, but indeed it has been quite unintentional on my side. I never had the smallest idea of it. Pray undeceive him as soon as you can, and tell him I beg his pardon. That is, I do not know what I ought to say, but make him understand what I mean in the properest way. I would not speak disrespectfully of a brother of yours, Isabella, I am sure, but you know very well that if I could think of one man more than another, he is not the person.
Isabella was silent.
My dear friend, you must not be angry with me. I cannot suppose your brother cares so very much about me, and you know we shall still be sisters.
Yes, yes.
With a blush.
There are more ways than one of our being sisters. But where am I wandering to? Well, my dear Catherine, the case seems to be that you are determined against poor John. Is not it so?
I certainly cannot return his affection, and as certainly never meant to encourage it.
Since that is the case, I am sure I shall not tease you any further. John desired me to speak to you on the subject, and therefore I have. But I confess, as soon as I read his letter, I thought it a very foolish, imprudent business, and not likely to promote the good of either. For what were you to live upon, supposing you came together? You have both of you something, to be sure, but it is not a trifle that will support a family nowadays. And after all that romancers may say, there is no doing without money. I only wonder John could think of it. He could not have received my last.
You do acquit me, then, of anything wrong? You are convinced that I never meant to deceive your brother, never suspected him of liking me till this moment?
Oh, as to that,
answered Isabella laughingly,
I do not pretend to determine what your thoughts and designs in time past may have been. All that is best known to yourself. A little harmless flirtation or so will occur, and one is often drawn on to give more encouragement than one wishes to stand by. But you may be assured that I am the last person in the world to judge you severely. All those things should be allowed for in youth and high spirits. What one means one day, you know, one may not mean the next. Circumstances change, opinions alter.
But my opinion of your brother never did alter. It was always the same. You are describing what never happened.
My dearest Catherine,
continued the other without at all listening to her,
I would not for all the world be the means of hurrying you into an engagement before you knew what you were about. I do not think anything would justify me in wishing you to sacrifice all your happiness merely to oblige my brother, because he is my brother, and who perhaps, after all, you know, might be just as happy without you, for people seldom know what they would be at, young men especially. They are so amazingly changeable and inconstant. What I say is, why should a brother's happiness be dearer to me than a friend's? You know, I carry my notions of friendship pretty high, but above all things, my dear Catherine, do not be in a hurry. Take my word for it, that if you are in too great a hurry, you will certainly live to repent it. Tilney says there is nothing people are so often deceived in as the state of their own affections, and I believe he is very right. Ah, here he comes. Never mind, he will not see us, I am sure.
Catherine, looking up, perceived Captain Tilney, and Isabella, earnestly fixing her eye on him as she spoke, soon caught his notice. He approached immediately, and took the seat to which her movements invited him. His first address made Catherine start. Though spoken low, she could distinguish.
What? Always to be watched? In person or by proxy?
Pshaw, nonsense,
was Isabella's answer in the same half-whisper.
Why do you put such things into my head? If I could believe it. My spirit, you know, is pretty independent.
I wish your heart were independent. That would be enough for me.
My heart, indeed. What can you have to do with hearts? You men have none of you any hearts.
If we have not hearts, we have eyes, and they give us torment enough.
Do they? I am sorry for it. I am sorry they find anything so disagreeable in me. I will look another way. I hope this pleases you.
Turning her back on him.
I hope your eyes are not tormented now.
Never more so. for the edge of the blooming cheek is still in view, at once too much and too little.
Catherine heard all this, and, quite out of countenance, could listen no longer. Amazed that Isabella could endure it, and jealous for her brother, she rose up, and saying,
"She should join Mrs. Allen,"
proposed their walking, but for this Isabella showed no inclination.
She was so amazingly tired, and it was so odious to parade about the pump room, and if she moved from her seat she should miss her sisters. She was expecting her sisters every moment, so that her dearest Catherine must excuse her, and must sit quietly down again.
But Catherine could be stubborn too, and Mrs. Allen, just then coming up to propose their returning home, she joined her and walked out of the pump room, leaving Isabella still sitting with Captain Tilney. With much uneasiness did she thus leave them. It seemed to her that Captain Tilney was falling in love with Isabella, and Isabella unconsciously encouraging him. Unconsciously it must be, for Isabella's attachment to James was as certain and well acknowledged as her engagement. To doubt her truth or good intentions was impossible, and yet during the whole of their conversation her manner had been odd. She wished Isabella had talked more like her usual self, and not so much about money, and had not looked so well pleased at the sight of Captain Tilney. How strange that she should not perceive his admiration! Catherine longed to give her a hint of it, to put her on her guard, and prevent all the pain which her too lively behaviour might otherwise create both for him and her brother. The compliment of John Thorpe's affection did not make amends for this thoughtlessness in his sister. She was almost as far from believing as from wishing it to be sincere, for she had not forgotten that he could mistake, and his assertion of the offer and of her encouragement convinced her that his mistakes could sometimes be very egregious. In vanity, therefore, she gained but little. Her chief profit was in wonder. That he should think it worth his while to fancy himself in love with her was a matter of lively astonishment. Isabella talked of his attentions. She had never been sensible of any. But Isabella had said many things which she hoped had been spoken in haste and would never be said again, and upon this she was glad to rest altogether for present ease and comfort. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Northanger Abbey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, Chapter 19. A few days passed away, and Catherine, though not allowing herself to suspect her friend, could not help watching her closely. The result of her observations was not agreeable. Isabella seemed an altered creature. When she saw her, indeed, surrounded only by their immediate friends in Edgar's Buildings or Pulteney Street, her change of manners was so trifling that, had it gone no farther, it might have passed unnoticed. A something of languid indifference, or of that boasted absence of mind which Catherine had never heard of before, would occasionally come across her, but had nothing worse appeared, that might have only spread a new grace and inspired a warmer interest. But when Catherine saw her in public admitting Captain Tilney's attentions as readily as they were offered, and allowing him almost an equal share with James in her notice and smiles, the alteration became too positive to be passed over. What could be meant by such unsteady conduct? What her friend could be at was beyond her comprehension. Isabella could not be aware of the pain she was inflicting, but it was a degree of wilful thoughtlessness which Catherine could not but resent. James was the sufferer. She saw him grave and uneasy, and, however careless of his present comfort the woman might be who had given him her heart, to her it was always an object. For poor Captain Tilney, too, she was greatly concerned. Though his looks did not please her, his name was a passport to her goodwill, and she thought with sincere compassion of his approaching disappointment, for, in spite of what she had believed herself to overhear in the pump-room, his behaviour was so incompatible with a knowledge of Isabella's engagement, that she could not, upon reflection, imagine him aware of it. He might be jealous of her brother as a rival, but if more had seemed implied, the fault must have been in her misapprehension. She wished, by a gentle remonstrance, to remind Isabella of her situation, and make her aware of this double unkindness. But for remonstrance either opportunity or comprehension was always against her. If able to suggest a hint, Isabella could never understand it. In this distress, the intended departure of the Tilney family became her chief consolation. Their journey into Gloucestershire was to take place within a few days, and Captain Tilney's removal would at least restore peace to every heart but his own. But Captain Tilney had at present no intention of removing. He was not to be of the party to Northanger. He was to continue at Bath. When Catherine knew this, her resolution was directly made. She spoke to Henry Tilney on the subject, regretting his brother's evident partiality for Miss Thorpe, and entreating him to make known her prior engagement.
My brother does know it,
was Henry's answer.
Does he? Then why does he stay here?
He made no reply, and was beginning to talk of something else, but she eagerly continued.
Why do not you persuade him to go away? The longer he stays, the worse it will be for him at last. Pray advise him for his own sake, and for everybody's sake, to leave Bath directly. Absence will in time make him comfortable again, but he can have no hope here, and it is only staying to be miserable.
Henry smiled and said,
I am sure my brother would not wish to do that.
Then you will persuade him to go away?
Persuasion is not at command. But pardon me if I cannot even endeavour to persuade him. I have myself told him that Miss Thorpe is engaged. He knows what he is about, and must be his own master.
No, he does not know what he is about,
cried Catherine.
He does not know the pain he is giving my brother. Not that James has ever told me so, but I am sure he is very uncomfortable.
And are you sure it is my brother's doing?
Yes, very sure.
Is it my brother's attentions to Miss Thorpe, or Miss Thorpe's admission of them, that gives the pain?
Is it not the same thing?
I think Mr. Morland would acknowledge a difference. No man is offended by another man's admiration of the woman he loves. It is the woman only who can make it a torment.
Catherine blushed for her friend, and said,
Isabella is wrong, but I am sure she cannot mean to torment, for she is very much attached to my brother. She has been in love with him ever since they first met, and while my father's consent was uncertain, she fretted herself almost into a fever. You know she must be attached to him.
I understand. She is in love with James, and flirts with Frederick.
Oh, no, not flirts. A woman in love with one man cannot flirt with another.
It is probable that she will neither love so well, nor flirt so well, as she might do either singly. The gentlemen must each give up a little.
After a short pause, Catherine resumed with,
Then you do not believe Isabella so very much attached to my brother?
I can have no opinion on that subject.
But what can your brother mean, if he knows her engagement? What can he mean by his behaviour?
You are a very close questioner.
Am I? I only ask what I want to be told.
But do you only ask what I can be expected to tell?
Yes, I think so, for you must know your brother's heart.
My brother's heart, as you term it, on the present occasion, I assure you I can only guess at.
Well?
Well! Nay, if it is to be guesswork, let us all guess for ourselves. To be guided by second-hand conjecture is pitiful. The premises are before you. My brother is a lively, and perhaps sometimes a thoughtless, young man. He has had about a week's acquaintance with your friend, and he has known her engagement almost as long as he has known her.
Well,
said Catherine, after some moments' consideration,
you may be able to guess at your brother's intentions from all this, but I am sure I cannot. But is not your father uncomfortable about it? Does not he want Captain Tilney to go away? Sure, if your father were to speak to him, he would go.
My dear Miss Morland,
said Henry,
in this amiable solicitude for your brother's comfort, may you not be a little mistaken? Are you not carried a little too far? Would he thank you, either on his own account or Miss Thorpe's, for supposing that her affection, or at least her good behaviour, is only to be secured by her seeing nothing of Captain Tilney? Is he safe only in solitude? Or is her heart constant to him only when unsolicited by anyone else? He cannot think this, and you may be sure that he would not have you think it. I will not say, do not be uneasy, because I know that you are so at this moment, but be as little uneasy as you can. You have no doubt of the mutual attachment of your brother and your friend. Depend upon it, therefore, that real jealousy never can exist between them. Depend upon it that no disagreement between them can be of any duration. Their hearts are open to each other, as neither heart can be to you. They know exactly what is required, and what can be borne, and you may be certain that one will never tease the other beyond what is known to be pleasant.
Perceiving her still to look doubtful and grave, he added,
"Though Frederick does not leave Bath with us, he will probably remain but a very short time, perhaps only a few days behind us. His leave of absence will soon expire, and he must return to his regiment. And what will then be their acquaintance? The mess room will drink Isabella Thorpe for a fortnight, and she will laugh with your brother over poor Tilney's passion for a month."
Catherine would contend no longer against comfort. She had resisted its approaches during the whole length of a speech, but it now carried her captive. Henry Tilney must know best. She blamed herself for the extent of her fears, and resolved never to think so seriously on the subject again. Her resolution was supported by Isabella's behaviour in their parting interview. The Thorpes spent the last evening of Catherine's stay in Pulteney Street, and nothing passed between the lovers to excite her uneasiness or make her quit them in apprehension. James was in excellent spirits, and Isabella most engagingly placid. Her tenderness for her friend seemed rather the first feeling of her heart, but that at such a moment was allowable, and once she gave her lover a flat contradiction, and once she drew back her hand, but Catherine remembered Henry's instructions, and placed it all to judicious affection. The embraces, tears, and promises of the parting fair ones may be fancied. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Northanger Abbey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. Chapter 20. Mr. and Mrs. Allen were sorry to lose their young friend, whose good humour and cheerfulness had made her a valuable companion, and in the promotion of whose enjoyment their own had been gently increased. Her happiness in going with Miss Tilney, however, prevented their wishing it otherwise, and as they were to remain only one more week in Bath themselves, her quitting them now would not long be felt. Mr. Allen attended her to Milsom Street, where she was to breakfast, and saw her seated with the kindest welcome among her new friends. But so great was her agitation in finding herself as one of the family, and so fearful was she of not doing exactly what was right, and of not being able to preserve their good opinion, that in the embarrassment of the first 5 minutes she could almost have wished to return with him to Pulteney Street. Miss Tilney's manners and Henry's smile soon did away some of her unpleasant feelings, but still she was far from being at ease, nor could the incessant attentions of the General himself entirely reassure her. Nay, perverse as it seemed, she doubted whether she might not have felt less had she been less attended to. His anxiety for her comfort, his continual solicitations that she would eat, and his often expressed fears of her seeing nothing to her taste, though never in her life before had she beheld half such variety on a breakfast table, made it impossible for her to forget for a moment that she was a visitor. She felt utterly unworthy of such respect, and knew not how to reply to it. Her tranquillity was not improved by the General's impatience for the appearance of his eldest son, nor by the displeasure he expressed at his laziness when Captain Tilney at last came down. She was quite pained by the severity of his father's reproof, which seemed disproportionate to the offence, and much was her concern increased when she found herself the principal cause of the lecture, and that his tardiness was chiefly resented from being disrespectful to her. This was placing her in a very uncomfortable situation, and she felt great compassion for Captain Tilney without being able to hope for his goodwill. He listened to his father in silence, and attempted not any defence, which confirmed her in fearing that the inquietude of his mind on Isabella's account might, by keeping him long sleepless, have been the real cause of his rising late. It was the first time of her being decidedly in his company, and she had hoped to be now able to form her opinion of him, but she scarcely heard his voice while his father remained in the room, and even afterwards, so much were his spirits affected, she could distinguish nothing but these words in a whisper to Eleanor.
"How glad I shall be when you are off."
The bustle of going was not pleasant. The clock struck 10 while the trunks were carrying down, and the General had fixed to be out of Milsom Street by that hour. His greatcoat, instead of being brought for him to put on directly, was spread out in the curricle in which he was to accompany his son. The middle seat of the chaise was not drawn out, though there were 3 people to go in it, and his daughter's maid had so crowded it with parcels that
Miss Morland would not have room to sit.
And so much was he influenced by this apprehension when he handed her in, that she had some difficulty in saving her own new writing desk from being thrown out into the street. At last, however, the door was closed upon the three females, and they set off at the sober pace in which the handsome, highly fed 4 horses of a gentleman usually perform a journey of 30 miles. Such was the distance of Northanger from Bath, to be now divided into 2 equal stages. Catherine's spirits revived as they drove from the door, for with Miss Tilney she felt no restraint, and with the interest of a road entirely new to her, of an abbey before and a curricle behind, she caught the last view of Bath without any regret, and met with every milestone before she expected it. The tediousness of a 2 hours' wait at Petit France, in which there was nothing to be done but to eat without being hungry, and loiter about without anything to see, next followed, and her admiration of the style in which they travelled, of the fashionable chaise and 4, postilions handsomely liveried rising so regularly in their stirrups, and numerous outriders properly mounted, sunk a little under this consequent inconvenience. Had their party been perfectly agreeable, the delay would have been nothing, but General Tilney, though so charming a man, seemed always a check upon his children's spirits, and scarcely anything was said but by himself, the observation of which, with his discontent at whatever the inn afforded, and his angry impatience at the waiters, made Catherine grow every moment more in awe of him, and appeared to lengthen the 2 hours into 4. At last, however, the order of release was given, and much was Catherine then surprised by the General's proposal of her taking his place in his son's curricle for the rest of the journey.
The day was fine, and he was anxious for her seeing as much of the country as possible.
The remembrance of Mr. Allen's opinion respecting young men's open carriages made her blush at the mention of such a plan, and her first thought was to decline it. But her second was of greater deference for General Tilney's judgment. He could not propose anything improper for her, and in the course of a few minutes she found herself with Henry in the curricle, as happy a being as ever existed. A very short trial convinced her that a curricle was the prettiest equipage in the world. The chaise and 4 wheeled off with some grandeur, to be sure, but it was a heavy and troublesome business, and she could not easily forget its having stopped 2 hours at Petit France. Half the time would have been enough for the curricle, and so nimbly were the light horses disposed to move, that had not the General chosen to have his own carriage lead the way, they could have passed it with ease in half a minute. But the merit of the curricle did not all belong to the horses. Henry drove so well, so quietly, without making any disturbance, without parading to her or swearing at them, so different from the only gentleman coachman whom it was in her power to compare him with. And then his hat sat so well, and the innumerable capes of his greatcoat looked so becomingly important. To be driven by him, next to being dancing with him, was certainly the greatest happiness in the world. In addition to every other delight, she had now that of listening to her own praise, of being thanked, at least on his sister's account, for her kindness in thus becoming her visitor, of hearing it ranked as real friendship, and described as creating real gratitude.
His sister,
he said,
was uncomfortably circumstanced. She had no female companion, and in the frequent absence of her father, was sometimes without any companion at all.
But how can that be?
Said Catherine.
Are you not with her?
Northanger is not more than half my home. I have an establishment at my own house in Woodston, which is nearly 20 miles from my father's, and some of my time is necessarily spent there.
How sorry you must be for that.
I am always sorry to leave Eleanor.
Yes, but besides your affection for her, you must be so fond of the Abbey. After being used to such a home as the Abbey, an ordinary parsonage house must be very disagreeable.
He smiled and said,
You have formed a very favourable idea of the Abbey.
To be sure I have. Is it not a fine old place, just like what one reads about?
And are you prepared to encounter all the horrors that a building such as what one reads about may produce? Have you a stout heart, nerves fit for sliding panels and tapestry?
Oh, yes, I do not think I should be easily frightened, because there would be so many people in the house, and besides, it has never been uninhabited, and left deserted for years. and then the family come back to it unawares, without giving any notice, as generally happens.
No, certainly. We shall not have to explore our way into a hall dimly lighted by the expiring embers of a wood fire, nor be obliged to spread our beds on the floor of a room without windows, doors, or furniture. But you must be aware that when a young lady is, by whatever means, introduced into a dwelling of this kind, she is always lodged apart from the rest of the family. While they snugly repair to their own end of the house, she is formally conducted by Dorothy, the ancient housekeeper, up a different staircase, and along many gloomy passages, into an apartment never used since some cousin or kin died in it, about 20 years before. Can you stand such a ceremony as this? Will not your mind misgive you when you find yourself in this gloomy chamber, too lofty and extensive for you, with only the feeble rays of a single lamp to take in its size, its walls hung with tapestry, exhibiting figures as large as life, and the bed of dark green stuff, or purple velvet, presenting even a funereal appearance? Will not your heart sink within you?
Oh, but this will not happen to me, I am sure.
How fearfully will you examine the furniture of your apartment, and what will you discern? Not tables, toilettes, wardrobes, or drawers, but on one side perhaps the remains of a broken lute, on the other a ponderous chest, which no efforts can open, and over the fireplace the portrait of some handsome warrior, whose features will so incomprehensibly strike you that you will not be able to withdraw your eyes from it. Dorothy, meanwhile, no less struck by your appearance, gazes on you in great agitation, and drops a few unintelligible hints. To raise your spirits, moreover, she gives you reason to suppose that the part of the abbey you inhabit is undoubtedly haunted, and informs you that you will not have a single domestic within call. With this parting cordial she curtsies off. You listen to the sound of her receding footsteps as long as the last echo can reach you, and when with fainting spirits you attempt to fasten your door, you discover, with increased alarm, that it has no lock.
Oh, Mr. Tilney, how frightful! This is just like a book. But it cannot really happen to me. I am sure your housekeeper is not really Dorothy. Well, what then?
Nothing further to alarm, perhaps, may occur the first night. After surmounting your unconquerable horror of the bed, you will retire to rest, and get a few hours' unquiet slumber. But on the second, or at furthest the third night after your arrival, you will probably have a violent storm. Peals of thunder so loud as to seem to shake the edifice to its foundation will roll round the neighbouring mountains, and during the frightful gusts of wind which accompany it, you will probably think you discern, for your lamp is not extinguished, one part of the hanging more violently agitated than the rest. Unable, of course, to repress your curiosity in so favourable a moment for indulging it, you will instantly arise, and throwing your dressing-gown around you, proceed to examine this mystery. After a very short search, you will discover a division in the tapestry, so artfully constructed as to defy the minutest inspection, and on opening it, a door will immediately appear, which door, being only secured by massy bars and a padlock, you will, after a few efforts, succeed in opening, and with your lamp in your hand, will pass through it into a small vaulted room.
No, indeed, I should be too much frightened to do any such thing.
What? Not when Dorothy has given you to understand that there is a secret subterraneous communication between your apartment and the chapel of St. Anthony scarcely 2 miles off? Could you shrink from so simple an adventure? No, no, you will proceed into this small vaulted room, and through this into several others, without perceiving anything very remarkable in either. In one, perhaps, there may be a dagger, in another a few drops of blood, and in a third the remains of some instrument of torture. But there being nothing in all this out of the common way, and your lamp being nearly exhausted, you will return towards your own apartment. In repassing through the small vaulted room, however, your eyes will be attracted towards a large old-fashioned cabinet of ebony and gold, which, though narrowly examining the furniture before, you had passed unnoticed. Impelled by an irresistible presentiment, you will eagerly advance to it, unlock its folding doors, and search into every drawer, but for some time without discovering anything of importance, perhaps nothing but a considerable hoard of diamonds. At last, however, by touching a secret spring, an inner compartment will open. A roll of paper appears. You seize it. It contains many sheets of manuscript. You hasten with the precious treasure into your own chamber, but scarcely have you been able to decipher, "Oh, thou, whomsoever thou mayst be, into whose hands these memoirs of the wretched Matilda may fall," when your lamp suddenly expires in the socket and leaves you in total darkness.
Oh, no, no, do not say so. Well, go on.
But Henry was too much amused by the interest he had raised to be able to carry it further. He could no longer command solemnity either of subject or voice, and was obliged to entreat her to use her own fancy in the perusal of Matilda's woes. Catherine, recollecting herself, grew ashamed of her eagerness, and began earnestly to assure him that her attention had been fixed, without the smallest apprehension of really meeting with what he related.
Miss Tilney, she was sure, would never put her into such a chamber as he had described. She was not at all afraid.
As they drew near the end of their journey, her impatience for a sight of the Abbey, for some time suspended by his conversation on subjects very different, returned in full force, and every bend in the road was expected with solemn awe to afford a glimpse of its massy walls of grey stone, rising amidst a grove of ancient oaks, with the last beams of the sun playing in beautiful splendour on its high Gothic windows. But so low did the building stand that she found herself passing through the great gates of the lodge into the very grounds of Northanger without having discerned even an antique chimney. She knew not that she had any right to be surprised, but there was a something in this mode of approach which she certainly had not expected. To pass between lodges of a modern appearance, to find herself with such ease in the very precincts of the Abbey, and driven so rapidly along a smooth level road of fine gravel, without obstacle, alarm, or solemnity of any kind, struck her as odd and inconsistent. She was not long at leisure, however, for such considerations. A sudden scud of rain, driving full in her face, made it impossible for her to observe anything further, and fixed all her thoughts on the welfare of her new straw bonnet. And she was actually under the Abbey walls, was springing with Henry's assistance from the carriage, was beneath the shelter of the old porch, and had even passed on to the hall, where her friend and the General were waiting to welcome her, without feeling one awful foreboding of future misery to herself, or one moment's suspicion of any past scenes of horror being acted within the solemn edifice. The breeze had not seemed to waft the sides of the murdered to her. It had wafted nothing worse than a thick mizzling rain, and having given a good shake to her habit, she was ready to be shown into the common drawing-room, and capable of considering where she was. An abbey! Yes, it was delightful to be really in an abbey. But she doubted, as she looked round the room, whether anything within her observation would have given her the consciousness. The furniture was in all the profusion and elegance of modern taste. The fireplace, where she had expected the ample width and ponderous carving of former times, was contracted to a Rumford, with slabs of plain though handsome marble, and ornaments over it of the prettiest English china. The windows, to which she looked with peculiar dependence, from having heard the general talk of his preserving them in their Gothic form with reverential care, were yet less what her fancy had portrayed. To be sure, the pointed arch was preserved, the form of them was Gothic, they might even be casements, but every pane was so large, so clear, so light. To an imagination which had hoped for the smallest divisions and the heaviest stonework, for painted glass, dirt, and cobwebs, the difference was very distressing. The General, perceiving how her eye was employed, began to talk of the smallness of the room and the simplicity of the furniture, where everything, being for daily use, pretended only to comfort, etc., flattering himself, however, that there were some apartments in the Abbey not unworthy of her notice, and was proceeding to mention the costly gilding of one in particular, when, taking out his watch, he stopped short to pronounce it with surprise.
"Within 20 minutes of 5."
This seemed the word of separation, and Catherine found herself hurried away by Miss Tilney in such a manner as convinced her that the strictest punctuality to the family hours would be expected at Northanger. Returning through the large and lofty hall, they ascended a broad staircase of shining oak, which, after many flights and many landing places, brought them upon a long wide gallery. On one side it had a range of doors, and it was lighted on the other by windows, which Catherine had only time to discover looked into a quadrangle, before Miss Tilney led the way into a chamber, and scarcely staying to hope she would find it comfortable, left her with an anxious entreaty that she would make as little alteration as possible in her dress. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Northanger Abbey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. Chapter 21. A moment's glance was enough to satisfy Catherine that her apartment was very unlike the one which Henry had endeavoured to alarm her by the description of. It was by no means unreasonably large, and contained neither tapestry nor velvet. The walls were papered, the floor was carpeted, the windows were neither less perfect nor more dim than those of the drawing-room below. The furniture, though not of the latest fashion, was handsome and comfortable, and the air of the room altogether far from uncheerful. Her heart instantaneously at ease on this point, she resolved to lose no time in particular examination of anything, as she greatly dreaded disobliging the General by any delay. Her habit, therefore, was thrown off with all possible haste, and she was preparing to unpin the linen package, which the chaise seat had conveyed for her immediate accommodation, when her eye suddenly fell on a large high chest, standing back in a deep recess on one side of the fireplace. The sight of it made her start, and, forgetting everything else, she stood gazing on it in motionless wonder, while these thoughts crossed her.
This is strange indeed. I did not expect such a sight as this. An immense heavy chest. What can it hold? Why should it be placed here? Pushed back, too, as if meant to be out of sight. I will look into it. Cost me what it may, I will look into it, and directly, too, by daylight. If I stay till evening, my candle may go out.
She advanced and examined it closely. It was of cedar, curiously inlaid with some darker wood, and raised about a foot from the ground on a carved stand of the same. The lock was silver, though tarnished from age. At each end were the imperfect remains of handles, also of silver, broken, perhaps prematurely by some strange violence, and on the centre of the lid was a mysterious cipher in the same metal. Catherine bent over it intently, but without being able to distinguish anything with certainty. She could not, in whatever direction she took it, believe the last letter to be a T, and yet that it should be anything else in that house was a circumstance to raise no common degree of astonishment. If not originally theirs, by what strange events could it have fallen into the Tilney family? Her fearful curiosity was every moment growing greater, and seizing with trembling hands the hasp of the lock, she resolved at all hazards to satisfy herself at least as to its contents. With difficulty, for something seemed to resist her efforts, she raised the lid a few inches. But at that moment a sudden knocking at the door of the room made her, starting, quit her hold, and the lid closed with alarming violence. This ill-timed intruder was Miss Tilney's maid, sent by her mistress to be of use to Miss Morland, and though Catherine immediately dismissed her, it recalled her to the sense of what she ought to be doing, and forced her, in spite of her anxious desire to penetrate this mystery, to proceed in her dressing without further delay. Her progress was not quick, for her thoughts and her eyes were still bent on the object so well calculated to interest and alarm, and though she dared not waste a moment upon a second attempt, she could not remain many paces from the chest. At length, however, having slipped one arm into her gown, her toilette seemed so nearly finished that the impatience of her curiosity might safely be indulged. One moment surely might be spared, and so desperate should be the exertion of her strength, that unless secured by supernatural means, the lid in one moment should be thrown back. With this spirit she sprang forward, and her confidence did not deceive her. Her resolute effort threw back the lid, and gave to her astonished eyes the view of a white cotton counterpane, properly folded, reposing at one end of the chest in undisputed possession. She was gazing on it with the first blush of surprise, when Miss Tilney, anxious for her friend's being ready, entered the room, and to the rising shame of having harboured for some minutes an absurd expectation, was then added the shame of being caught in so idle a search.
"That is a curious old chest, is not it?"
said Miss Tilney, as Catherine hastily closed it and turned away to the glass.
It is impossible to say how many generations it has been here. How it came to be first put in this room I know not, but I have not had it moved, because I thought it might sometimes be of use in holding hats and bonnets. The worst of it is that its weight makes it difficult to open. In that corner, however, it is at least out of the way.
Catherine had no leisure for speech, being at once blushing, tying her gown, and forming wise resolutions with the most violent dispatch. Miss Tilney gently hinted her fear of being late, and in half a minute they ran downstairs together, in an alarm not wholly unfounded, for General Tilney was pacing the drawing-room, his watch in his hand, and having on the very instant of their entering pulled the bell with violence, ordered
"Dinner to be on table directly."
Catherine trembled at the emphasis with which he spoke, and sat pale and breathless, in a most humble mood, concerned for his children and detesting old chests. And the General, recovering his politeness as he looked at her, spent the rest of his time in scolding his daughter for so foolishly hurrying her fair friend, who was absolutely out of breath from haste, when there was not the least occasion for hurry in the world. But Catherine could not at all get over the double distress of having involved her friend in a lecture, and been a great simpleton herself, till they were happily seated at the dinner-table, when the General's complacent smiles, and a good appetite of her own, restored her to peace. The dining parlour was a noble room, suitable in its dimensions to a much larger drawing-room than the one in common use, and fitted up in a style of luxury and expense which was almost lost on the unpractised eye of Catherine, who saw little more than its spaciousness and the number of their attendants. Of the former she spoke aloud her admiration, and the General, with a very gracious countenance, acknowledged that
it was by no means an ill-sized room,
and further confessed that,
though he was careless on such subjects as most people, he did look upon a tolerably large eating-room as one of the necessaries of life.
He supposed, however, that
she must have been used to much better-sized apartments at Mr. Allen's.
No, indeed,
was Catherine's honest assurance.
Mr. Allen's dining parlour was not half so large, and she had never seen so large a room as this in her life.
The General's good humour increased.
Why, as he had such rooms, he thought it would be simple not to make use of them. But, upon his honour, he believed there might be more comfort in rooms of only half their size. Mr. Allen's house, he was sure, must be exactly the true size for rational happiness.
The evening passed without any further disturbance, and, in the occasional absence of General Tilney, with much positive cheerfulness. It was only in his presence that Catherine felt the smallest fatigue from her journey, and even then, even in moments of languor or restraint, a sense of general happiness preponderated, and she could think of her friends in Bath without one wish of being with them. The night was stormy, the wind had been rising at intervals the whole afternoon, and by the time the party broke up it blew and rained violently. Catherine, as she crossed the hall, listened to the tempest with sensations of awe, and when she heard it rage round a corner of the ancient building, and close with sudden fury a distant door, felt for the first time that she was really in an abbey. Yes, these were characteristic sounds. They brought to her recollection a countless variety of dreadful situations and horrid scenes which such buildings had witnessed and such storms ushered in, and most heartily did she rejoice in the happier circumstances attending her entrance within walls so solemn. She had nothing to dread from midnight assassins or drunken gallants. Henry had certainly been only in jest in what he had told her that morning. In a house so furnished and so guarded she could have nothing to explore or to suffer, and might go to her bedroom as securely as if it had been her own chamber at Fullerton. Thus wisely fortifying her mind, as she proceeded upstairs, she was enabled, especially on perceiving that Miss Tilney slept only 2 doors from her, to enter her room with a tolerably stout heart, and her spirits were immediately assisted by the cheerful blaze of a wood fire.
"How much better is this?"
said she, as she walked to the fender.
"How much better to find a fire ready lit than to have to wait shivering in the cold till all the family are in bed. as so many poor girls have been obliged to do, and then to have a faithful old servant frightening one by coming in with a faggot. How glad I am that Northanger is what it is. If it had been like some other places, I do not know that, in such a night as this, I could have answered for my courage, but now, to be sure, there is nothing to alarm one."
She looked round the room. The window curtain seemed in motion. It could be nothing but the violence of the wind penetrating through the divisions of the shutters, and she stepped boldly forward, carelessly humming a tune, to assure herself of its being so, peeped courageously behind each curtain, saw nothing on either low window seat to scare her, and on placing a hand against the shutter felt the strongest conviction of the wind's force. A glance at the old chest as she turned away from this examination was not without its use. She scorned the causeless fears of an idle fancy, and began with a most happy indifference to prepare herself for bed.
She should take her time. She should not hurry herself. She did not care if she were the last person up in the house. But she would not make up her fire, that would seem cowardly, as if she wished for the protection of light after she were in bed.
The fire, therefore, died away, and Catherine, having spent the best part of an hour in her arrangements, was beginning to think of stepping into bed, when on giving a parting glance round the room, she was struck by the appearance of a high, old-fashioned black cabinet, which, though in a situation conspicuous enough, had never caught her notice before. Henry's words, his description of the ebony cabinet which was to escape her observation at first, immediately rushed across her, and though there could be nothing really in it, there was something whimsical. It was certainly a very remarkable coincidence. She took her candle and looked closely at the cabinet. It was not absolutely ebony and gold, but it was Japan, black and yellow Japan, of the handsomest kind, and as she held her candle, the yellow had very much the effect of gold. The key was in the door, and she had a strange fancy to look into it, not, however, with the smallest expectation of finding anything. But it was so very odd, after what Henry had said. In short, she could not sleep till she had examined it. So, placing the candle with great caution on a chair, she seized the key with a very tremulous hand and tried to turn it. But it resisted her utmost strength. Alarmed, but not discouraged, she tried it another way. A bolt flew, and she believed herself successful. But how strangely mysterious! The door was still immovable. She paused a moment in breathless wonder. The wind roared down the chimney, the rain beat in torrents against the windows, and everything seemed to speak the awfulness of her situation. To retire to bed, however, unsatisfied on such a point, would be in vain, since sleep must be impossible with the consciousness of a cabinet so mysteriously closed in her immediate vicinity. Again, therefore, she applied herself to the key, and after moving it in every possible way for some instants, with the determined celerity of hope's last effort, the door suddenly yielded to her hand. Her heart leaped with exultation at such a victory, and having thrown open each folding door, the second being secured only by bolts of less wonderful construction than the lock, though in that her eye could not discern anything unusual, a double range of small drawers appeared in view, with some larger drawers above and below them, and in the centre a small door, closed also with a lock and key, secured in all probability a cavity of importance. Catherine's heart beat quick, but her courage did not fail her. With a cheek flushed by hope and an eye straining with curiosity, her fingers grasped the handle of a drawer and drew it forth. It was entirely empty. With less alarm and greater eagerness she seized a second, a third, a fourth. Each was equally empty. Not one was left unsearched, and in not one was anything found. Well read in the art of concealing a treasure, the possibility of false linings to the drawers did not escape her, and she felt round each with anxious acuteness in vain. The place in the middle alone remained now unexplored, and though she had
never from the first had the smallest idea of finding anything in any part of the cabinet, and was not in the least disappointed at her ill success thus far, It would be foolish not to examine it thoroughly while she was about it.
It was some time, however, before she could unfasten the door, the same difficulty occurring in the management of this inner lock as of the outer. But at length it did open, and not in vain, as hitherto was her search. Her quick eyes directly fell on a roll of paper pushed back into the further part of the cavity, apparently for concealment, and her feelings at that moment were indescribable. Her heart fluttered, her knees trembled, and her cheeks grew pale. She seized with an unsteady hand the precious manuscript, for half a glance sufficed to ascertain written characters, and while she acknowledged with awful sensations this striking exemplification of what Henry had foretold, resolved instantly to peruse every line before she attempted to rest. The dimness of the light her candle emitted made her turn to it with alarm, but there was no danger of its sudden extinction. It had yet some hours to burn, and that she might not have any greater difficulty in distinguishing the writing than what its ancient date might occasion, she hastily snuffed it. Alas, it was snuffed and extinguished in one. A lamp could not have expired with more awful effect. Catherine, for a few moments, was motionless with horror. It was done completely. Not a remnant of light in the wick could give hope to the rekindling breath. Darkness, impenetrable and immovable, filled the room. A violent gust of wind, rising with sudden fury, added fresh horror to the moment. Catherine trembled from head to foot. In the pause which succeeded, a sound like receding footsteps and the closing of a distant door struck on her affrighted ear. Human nature could support no more. A cold sweat stood on her forehead. The manuscript fell from her hand, and groping her way to the bed, she jumped hastily in, and sought some suspension of agony by creeping far underneath the clothes. To close her eyes in sleep that night she felt must be entirely out of the question. With a curiosity so justly awakened, and feelings in every way so agitated, repose must be absolutely impossible. The storm, too, abroad, so dreadful. She had not been used to feel alarm from wind, but now every blast seemed fraught with awful intelligence.
The manuscript so wonderfully found, so wonderfully accomplishing the morning's prediction. How was it to be accounted for? What could it contain? To whom could it relate? By what means could it have been so long concealed? And how singularly strange that it should fall to her lot to discover it.
Till she had made herself mistress of its contents, however, she could have neither repose nor comfort, and with the sun's first rays she was determined to peruse it. But many were the tedious hours which must yet intervene. She shuddered, tossed about in her bed, and envied every quiet sleeper. The storm still raged, and various were the noises, more terrific even than the wind which struck at intervals on her startled ear. The very curtains of her bed seemed at one moment in motion, and at another the lock of her door was agitated as if by the attempt of somebody to enter. Hollow murmurs seemed to creep along the gallery, and more than once her blood was chilled by the sound of distant moans. Hour after hour passed away, and the wearied Catherine had heard 3 proclaimed by all the clocks in the house, before the tempest subsided, or she unknowingly fell fast asleep. End of chapter 21.